particularly busy time of the year, and we're really thrilled that so many of you can join us today for this event. So I'm Marion Schmidt. I'm the president of the Association of University Professors and Heads of French Plus. This is our historical name, but we're actually open to all members of French Studies. And in case you're not familiar with AUPHF Plus, so we're a subject association, we lobby and we advocate for French and Francophone studies. And among our activities, we organize an annual event where we share experiences about teaching and research. So in this workshop today, Decolonising French Studies, we want to continue conversations about the pressing, indeed the vital need to decolonize our discipline. And I think many of us are currently engaged in attempts to decolonize our curriculum, but we're often still grappling with understanding what exactly this involves in intellectual terms, but also in practical terms. And I just want to quote one of my colleagues here from Edinburgh, who said in a recent meeting, it's not just about adding a few texts by non-white, non-European authors. That can be a starting point, but it's definitely not, you know, decolonizing the discipline. So what does it mean to decolonize our teaching, to make it more inclusive, to make it more diverse? Also, what does it mean to decolonize our research and our fortiori, the institutional practices in which we operate? What cultural and epistemic changes are needed to decolonize our institutions, and what challenges and resistances do we need to overcome? And these are just some of the key questions which we want to address in this workshop today. So we've got a really exciting lineup of speakers who are going to talk about the implications of decolonial thinking in research, what it can do to advance social justice, and of course, how it affects what we teach and how we teach it. We're going to finish with a round table, which brings together colleagues from French and cognate disciplines who will exchange about what decolonizing means in their respective fields and how it can be enacted. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome Raina Walcott, who is a PhD researcher at King's College London. She's also a writer and an activist, and she's going to present the work of the collective project Myopia. So welcome, Raina. And I also want to extend a very warm welcome to Professor Nicola from the University of Lausanne, who many of you will know as a leading expert on French colonial and post-colonial history, and he's also going to join us in the round table. There's going to be plenty of time for discussion, for exchange after the presentations, and we very much hope that you are going to join in this conversation. So without further ado, enjoy the workshop, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Rebecca Dixon, who is going to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Marion. Sorry, I was just having a bit of trouble with my video there. Yeah, it gives me great pleasure to kick off this first session and to introduce our first speaker to you, Professor Nadia Kiwan of the University of Aberdeen. Nadia's research, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, focuses primarily on contemporary French and Francophone cultures and societies, and she places particular interest in public discourses around post-colonial migration, secularism, and Islam. And she also focuses on decolonial and intersectional social movements. And I think many of these things are going to be forming part of her presentation this afternoon, which is entitled Decolonising Secularism, Recent Debates on Islamo-leftism in France. Thank you. Thanks, Nadia.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that introduction. And first of all, good afternoon to everyone, and thanks very much to the AUPF PHF Plus, I've got the right name, and all the organisers for inviting me to just share some of my thoughts with you about decolonising French studies. As Rebecca said, I'm based at Aberdeen, where I've been since 2006, but I'm particularly interested in what the discussions we'll have today, because I'm going to be taking over the role of undergraduate programme coordinator this autumn. So this is something I'm thinking about quite a lot at the moment. I guess you could say that my interests in decolonising French studies, it started before there was a well-known term for this process or this conversation. And when I was nearing the end of my undergraduate degree in French and politics at the University of Bristol, which is our host today. So over the course of my 4-year degree in the mid to late 1990s, I can't really say that I encountered many texts or topics which covered France's post-colonial status or the legacy of empire in depth. Today that certainly shifted, and being an external examiner at Bristol, I can confirm that there are many fantastic modules which do this. But going back to my own undergraduate experience, I think the only place where I had encountered topics of a post-colonial nature was via the French oral classes with the lecteur and lectrice, where we sometimes approached contemporary current affairs type topics linked to immigration. So those classes certainly piqued my interest, in addition to my Erasmus year at Sciences Po in Bordeaux in 1996 and 97, where what I saw and experienced of contemporary French society around me didn't really tally with my undergraduate studies or modules. So I graduated and embarked on a postgraduate study program in 1998, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is the same year that France's multi-ethnic football team won the World Cup. And that undoubtedly gave more visibility to post-colonial themes and their relevance to contemporary France. And a lot has been achieved in terms of opening up the canon of UK French studies curricula, particularly since the post-colonial turn of the early 2000s onwards. Nevertheless, I find that a couple of decades on, and certainly in my own research and teaching on themes such as secularism, laïcité, Islam, Islamophobia, and decolonial feminisms in contemporary France, there are still quite a few challenges in terms of decolonising French studies methodologies, its archives, and its concepts. So we were asked to think about 3 questions for our presentations today. And the first one was, how do you define your field and experience, from your field and experience, decolonising? And so I'll start with that. And I should emphasize that I understand decolonising French studies as very much an ongoing conversation, one in which I'm still very much learning about myself. And so in French studies, I would define decolonising the curriculum as an open-ended process, whereby academic staff involved in delivering teaching to undergraduates move beyond the important post-colonial turn which characterized French studies from the 2000 onwards. So, and I mentioned I'm very happy that Charles Forsdyk and David Murphy are here today, because it was their Francophone post-colonial studies book in 2003, as well as Nicola Bancel and Pascal Blanchard and Sandrine Lemaire's book, La Fracture Coloniale, in 2005, which were really key texts for me personally, but also in terms of, fostering this post-colonial turn. So that was something which happened really, in the early 2000s. It was really important in wedging open the canon to authors, texts, and to topics which extended beyond the hexagon or the hexagon. So the inclusion of Francophone texts or authors from beyond hexagonal France and modules about post-migrant experiences within France into the curriculum was, really key in terms of decentering French studies. However, it seems to me that the decolonial turn, which we're talking about so much these days in French studies, is about perhaps acknowledging, as Marion said in her introduction, acknowledging the need to move beyond a sort of inclusion or sort of additive model to curriculum design towards one which explores the ways in which many of the discipline's foundational concepts continue to be entangled with what Medina Tostanova calls an enduring coloniality of perception. So in terms of sort of, how can this be enacted? What practical forms might it take? I'm going to move on to that now. I think more specifically, I would argue that decolonising French studies, and of course, many other disciplines in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, involves a re-evaluation of many of the core concepts which we work with, either as learners, educators, or researchers. And it's true to say that Francophone post-colonial scholars have critically reappraised some key concepts, such as, La République or universalism in recent years. But I would argue that much of that conceptual work is coming at the moment from beyond modern languages, strictly speaking, so within history, sociology, political philosophy, or political theory. So for me, within the discipline of French studies itself, decolonising the curriculum, especially at undergraduate level, involves a sort of in-depth and sustained examination of the genealogy of certain key concepts, which then become part of public discourse and academic discourse as well. So for me, decolonising French studies, it involves a move from a kind of geographical or sort of spatial adaptation of the curricula to a more conceptual adaptation of that curriculum. So decolonising the conceptual assumptions which undergird many aspects of our research and teaching agendas might entail what Ariana Azoulay calls a sort of examination of the imperial foundations of knowledge, and I'm quoting from Azoulay's Unlearning Imperialism there. Or to put it another way, it might involve examining the enduring sort of coloniality of a range of political concepts that we use in French, but also in modern languages beyond that, such as, but certainly not limited to, modernity, universalism, equality, feminism, autonomy, or secularism. And I'm going to focus on just one concept today, secularism or laïcité, although that's a concept which evidently overlaps with other concepts such as universalism, modernity, or equality. So I choose to focus on secularism, or this what Quasi-Wiredu called conceptual decolonisation when it comes to secularism for several reasons, 3 reasons really, which I want to highlight. So the first is, selfishly, it's a major focus of my own research. Secondly, and perhaps more significantly for our purposes today, secularism is, it's a highly salient issue within contemporary French public and political life. So the intractable debates over how the French government should manage its Muslim population, which have molded French public discourse for the last 30 years and counting, are always sort of somewhere there in the background, seemingly lying dormant for a while before resurging like a sort of repressed impulse into the discursive frames of political parties, the media, academia, and civil society. So I'm not going to rehearse the well-worn and well-known arc of that story, save to say that it starts and continues with the policing of girls' and women's bodies, their clothing, so the headscarf affairs and legislation. And it moves more recently towards a context where President Macron's bill on on separatism and the higher education minister Dominique Vidal's call for an investigation into Islamo-gauchisme in French universities are currently setting the tone for the public debate. And the third reason I propose that we should focus some of our discussion today on secularism when thinking about decolonising French studies is because the question of secularism, Islam, the place of French Muslims in France, is commonly taught, or increasingly commonly taught, within UK French studies undergraduate programmes, both on pre-honours sort of survey courses and in more specialised research-led modules. However, my sense is that the topic's often framed in quite limited terms, and I include myself in this critique, right? I think that the narrative generally goes something like this. France has difficulty coming to terms with post-colonial migration on a massive scale in the post-World War II period. Or more recently, France has been subjected to a wave of devastating terror attacks, some of them perpetrated by its own Muslim citizens. So it has sought to stem a tide of Muslim separatism via the weaponization of secularism in political discourse. So, and this may sometimes have been undertaken in a clumsy manner, but the urgency of the security situation explains some of the potential maladresse of policy initiatives such as the botched déchéance de nationalité proposals, or the transformation of some aspects of the post-terror attack state of emergency, état d'urgence, into a permanent sort of legal framework in many in different ways. However, within such teaching and research agendas, there tends to be less consideration of the genealogy of the concept of laïcité and its links to much broader Western European processes of secularization. So I'm drawing here on the work of scholars in political philosophy mainly. So people like Sophie Lauwers and Anya Topolsky. They argue that in order to better understand what they call the race-religion constellation at work in many European countries today, including France, whereby racialized Muslims are consistently posited as secularism's incommensurable other, we need to look at the historical origins of secularism as a political doctrine. And in turn, Lauwers and Topolsky draw on the work of comparative literature scholar Gil Anidjar, who argues somewhat polemically that in post-Reformation Europe, Christianity reinvents itself as secularism. That is, much of that which passes for secular is in fact strongly connected to Christian cultural norms and Christian understandings of religion as somehow being separate from public life, from the public sphere. I also draw on the work, in my thinking about this, on the work of Joan Scott, who's done critical historical research on the concept of laïcité in France. And her book, Sex and Secularism, from 2017, argues that the discourse around invoking the need to reinvigorate secularism in order to protect gender equality for French Muslim women is problematic when one recognizes that the discourse of secularism which develops in post-revolutionary France is precisely bound up with a number of hierarchical boundaries, such as man, woman, reason, emotion, and crucially, public and private spheres. So I'm just going to move now on to my sort of third question, which I was asked to address for today. What are there any conceptual limits or any oppositions, resistance which need to be overcome, and thinking about how we make our subject area more relevant for future generations of learners. So I'll try and do that. So I think a decolonizing approach to the concept of secularism and other connected concepts, equality, feminism, universalism, within French studies would allow an opening up of discussions beyond the type of accounts which argues that laïcité is basically a sound concept, but it's just been kind of falsifié, as the historian Jean Boubereau argues, and also moves beyond sort of critical republicanist frameworks of someone like Cécile Laborde, whose work I very much admire, but who argues that laïcité needs to be maintained, albeit via an agenda of non-domination. So decolonizing secularism as a concept would take seriously the race-religion constellation and the gender equality issues which lie at its heart. And this would then allow our educators, researchers, and students of French studies to maybe better deconstruct and decode some of those really intractable debates which paralyze French public discourse and which often thrive quite simply on those unhelpful binaries of Islam versus secularism, Islam versus gender equality, and latterly so-called Islamo-gauchist research versus proper scientific rigor. So if you've been following the news about this, the call by government Minister for Higher Education, Frédéric Vidal, to investigate Islamo-gauchisme or Islamo-leftism in French universities and research centres was certainly met with, robust opposition amongst the research community, who claimed that this was, an empty kind of concept, an empty accusation. However, I think that this latest episode of the last couple of months or so hints at a kind of a reinforcement of what Ayan Kaya calls Islamophobia as governmentality. So in that Foucauldian sense, which becomes even more pronounced as France gears up for the 2022 presidential elections. So I think beyond such short-term electoral dynamics, the question remains, how do we as educators and researchers in the UK teach such topics in our curricula? How do we approach this in a decolonized or decolonial way? I think if we're following a decolonising concepts agenda, then courses, which I teach, which many of you will teach, which explore Islam and Islamophobia in contemporary France, would depart from an approach which foregrounds immigration, national identity, and the post-terror state of exception as sort of frameworks of perception. Perhaps more fundamentally, it would also depart from an approach which posits laïcité as a sort of stable equality-bearing framework on the one hand, and religious minorities as the problem on the other hand. So decolonising how we see or perceive laïcité could involve an alternative archive, which would drill down into the ways in which secularism as a political project is historically bound up with this, with a hierarchical ordering of difference. So difference between men and women, difference between those of Christian heritage and those who are not. And latterly in debates around secular feminism versus, decolonial feminisms. So this alternative archive might facilitate a more nuanced understanding of one of the central issues affecting contemporary French society. And beyond that, I think that such an approach could provide the student body with a range of critical tools which are relevant beyond the French studies elements of their degree, and indeed necessary civic tools with which to counter resurgent racisms and structural inequality in the UK, Europe, and beyond. So this is not simply a question of making the curriculum more relevant in order to recruit a more diverse student body, i.e. the co-opting of decolonisation agendas by university management or admissions teams as a marketing tool. It's, in my view, a much more foundational issue, one which goes beyond curricular design towards one where researchers and educators explore more carefully the global conditions of knowledge production. And furthermore, it raises the question of just who our future undergraduates, postgraduates, and scholars in the UK will be, in UK French studies will be, or should be, and how they can contribute to a decolonising process, not just of the discipline, but of academia more broadly. And I'll leave it there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I can't see that anybody has flagged a question in the chat, but let me just change my view so that I can see people. Would anybody like to start off the questions this afternoon? Let me just see, I can't see anybody. Okay, I'm seeing applause, not raised hands. So yeah, so I suppose then, yeah, Nadia, could you say just a little bit more, please, about, I was really interested with the point that you were making, well, all the points you're making, of course, but the point you were making towards the end about kind of giving students, the sort of empowering students through civic tools and so on to move forward with this. Can you say a little bit more about how you go about that in your own practice? And
yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have a sort of fully formed answer to that, but I think, well, I guess the University of Aberdeen, where I am, we talk a lot about graduate attributes. That was a big thing. And when we did this, we did curriculum, we started on a process of curriculum reform, which goes back to 2007. And it involved, all sorts of changes. One of them, which was actually encouraging language learning, right? Foreign language learning. But one of the graduate attributes, which, our sort is sort of fostering kind of citizenship or kind of some civic values, right? And I think sometimes that gets lost, but I would hope that certainly within my own teaching, that when I'm talking about these very, you know, Franco-French issues, that I'm able to sort of create links and say, have you seen what's going on in the UK on this question? Or what about what's going on in the US? Or latterly, I mean, you know, the sort of attacks on academics in France can be akin to some of the issues which are going on in, you know, places which wouldn't necessarily think about, but places like Turkey, like Brazil, you know, this idea of delegitimizing certain voices and silencing certain voices. So to make people aware of, you know, their own kind of immediate locale. But that's not always easy to do. But I think it's certainly, I think modern languages study, you know, modern linguists are very good at sort of attention to detail, that sort of thing, and critical thinking. So I guess it's encouraging critical thinking beyond the sort of the narrow focus of, you know, what do I need to do to get a first in my essay? You know, yeah.
Superb, thank you. That is really useful, actually, just I think for all of us kind of thinking about these kind of issues and moving forward with them. We have some questions in the chat. Some people wanting to ask questions. Let me just see who's in first. Firstly, Amy, if you would like to ask your question, please.
Sure. Very simple question. I was just wondering, could I get a repeat of the name of the scholar who had argued about that Christianity reshaped itself into secularism in the post-revolutionary era? I didn't get it, or didn't get spelling of it, at least.
I realized I should have done PowerPoints like my colleagues, but I didn't get around to it. But there's his name in the chat. So Dilanijar, yeah.
Thank you so much. As a medievalist, this is filling a gap. I'm going to fill a gap.
The other people I should have also put in the chat are, I'm just doing that now in case, because they're not like in French studies, so people not maybe all familiar with them, but there we go.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nadia. David Ewing, would you like to ask, please?
Hi, thanks, Nadia. I was just wondering, so what you were saying about the post-colonial turn, and so yeah, I think I was at primary school when that was happening, but I was just kind of wanting to hear, given that possibly a lot of the kind of conceptual resources for thinking in what we might understand to be a decolonial frame or register, or getting outside a coloniality of perspective, would be there in the resources that are feeding into that turn, and kind of I suppose since at least kind of the mid-20th century. I was wondering if you felt that why then, if that's the case, why then was it kind of limited to this kind of geographical or spatial extension, and what sort of conditions may have changed, or whether that was sort of more peculiar to French studies, and in kind of other disciplines, something like what we might recognize now as a decolonial or decolonising turn had kind of been underway more or less at the same time as that post-colonial turn.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's thank you for asking it, because I don't want to sort of I don't know, simplify what the post-colonial turn was at all, you know, because that was definitely key in my own formation as a researcher, and I'm not arguing that it was only about geographical, adding in a few authors here and there. It did give us an important conceptual apparatus. I think perhaps where I found it limiting for me, or where I felt this is something which I've discovered kind of quite recently in my own thinking about secularism in Islam, it's actually, when we're thinking about laïcité, I have found it very difficult to get beyond Franco-French conceptualizations of laïcité, which always go back to 1905 and say, well, look, it's about this, the separation of the state and religion, and that's how we need to approach it. And then the sort of Jean Bobéreau type accounts, which say, this is basically really a sound model, but it's become falsifié by the sort of, Le Penisme and sort of Front National type discourses. But it wasn't until I kind of read beyond that sort of Franco-French focus myself and looked at more, sort of broader, more European perspectives on secularization, I kind of realized it gave me the tools to be able to critique that, if you like, sort of say this is not a stable category, and that it's a lot more messy than that, and so maybe we need to revisit that as a concept. But that's my own kind of thinking about that issue. I don't know if that answers your question or begins to.
That's really helpful.
Marvellous, thanks both of you. Nikki, would you like to ask your question now, please?
Hi, thanks Nadia, that was really interesting. And I wanted to ask you, because I love this idea that actually what we need to do is go back and think about those foundational concepts. You listed some of them. And I'm just wondering, like, as a practical step, what would you suggest, we all teach obviously in French and Francophone studies, and we're increasingly sort of thinking about how decoloniality ought to be an integral part of our classroom and how we teach. Do you have any ideas, not to put it on the spot, but just like how we could take this forward, in terms of like thinking about how we work collaboratively across institutions as well on this kind of thing? Because I think you're absolutely right. It does start with understanding the history and legacies of those concepts. So that was my question.
Yeah. Again, a great question, and I don't sort of have a reading list to sort of send to the workshop chat just now, but I really think it comes from interdisciplinarity, and talking to colleagues in other disciplines. I mean, I've learned a lot from historians, for example, and like I say, from political theorists and the theory. I think sometimes what happens within French curricular design, we're often told, oh, you need to only engage with French language sources, or maximum with French language sources, because we're fostering modern linguist sort of development, and that's great. But sometimes I think in some topics, my own kind of topics, that can be we can miss some of the debates which are going on, and I think, I mean, myself and some colleagues who are here today, and you, in fact, Nicola, we're trying to put together this network on decolonising modern languages in universities in Scotland. We had our first roundtable workshop with the Scottish Graduate School of Arts and Humanities just last Friday. So it's like on the decolonising road show at the moment. But that sort of thing is really great because it's beyond French. It's with other colleagues, where people say Spanish and Latin American studies might say, well, we've been doing this. Latin America's been post-colonial, for a long time, much longer, and that sort of thing. And of course, all the decolonial studies framework often it comes out of Latin American studies. So I think it's, in talking to other people via those sorts of networks, getting funding as well to speak to each other. Well, over Zoom, it's dirt cheap, but, in a post-COVID world. So that's a bit of a rambling response to say interdisciplinarity and network.
Thanks.
Thank you. So Saskia's put a question in the chat. Saskia writes that, Nadia, you mentioned working with new archives or reinventing the archive. How do you envisage that more concretely?
Yeah. I think it's I think it's that there's a sort of real practical issue there, in terms of how we, how can you undertake kind of conceptual decolonisation? This is not my term at all, of course, it's Wiridu's term. And I think getting access to different views, different frameworks is not easy when you're sitting in a university in the global north, and this, I think, speaks to a much bigger question about how I guess knowledge is produced and how it's disseminated, and who's sort of allowed to publish, or the gatekeeping which goes around with that. So I think as far as possible, engaging with, I don't know, authors who are explicitly pushing for a decolonial framework, whether that's authors who are in the global south and whose work is not necessarily always available to us. That's one concrete way of doing it, but it's a very painful, slow work, and I don't have an easy answer, but apart from that, really. So I don't think it's about a new archive. I don't think it's that idea of, chucking out what, European intellectual history or something like that. It's recognizing that's invaluable, right? That's indispensable in the sense that Chakraborty is talking about in provincializing Europe. But it's sort of saying that that's essential, or indispensable, but it's just inadequate. So we need to just be mindful of that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Another question in the chat from Ruth this time. Ruth's question is a follow-on about curricula and French language sources. How far are you able to integrate Arabic language or translated materials into your teaching on this topic, and how do students respond?
Yeah. Yeah. I have only been able to introduce, Arabic comes into the program, say, when teaching film and some sort of visual culture, but I haven't introduced it yet in terms of actual reading materials. So I'd be interested to hear from colleagues if they have done something like that. Yeah, I can't say that I've had experience about them dealing with a lot of Arabic language material beyond the sort of the kind of films which will have the presence of French and Arabic in them, for example. And that goes back to the previous question, I think, about the difficulties also, right? Yeah. So please, if anyone has had any experience themselves in doing this sort of thing, then, I'd really be keen to hear from you.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, if anybody wants to, at this stage, put anything in the chat, I suppose, about that kind of issue, then we'll pick up on that later, or maybe in the roundtable or something, we'll come back to that topic. I'm just looking at the chat and looking at the, as it were, room. I can't see that there are any more questions at the moment for Nadia. So unless anybody wants to pipe up just now with a last gasp question, shall we let Nadia relax into the rest of the workshop and thank her once again for an absolutely fascinating first presentation for this afternoon. Thank you. Thanks, Nadia.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nadia and Rebecca. That was a really, really fascinating first presentation. We're going to continue at 2:45 with Nikki, so we just have 3 minutes if you just want to grab a coffee or a tea, and we're going to continue at 45, okay? Okay, welcome back, everybody. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Nicola Frith, who is a dear colleague here at the University of Edinburgh. She's a senior lecturer in French and Francophone studies. And Nicola is one of the co-founders of the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, INOSAR, and they've got an absolutely excellent website. So if you want to find out about their great work, have a look at the website. Her research engages with the memories and legacies of African enslavement, with a particular focus on activist organizations, social movements, and reparatory and social justice. She has published a monograph on the French colonial imagination, as well as numerous articles and edited collections on the subject of memory, slavery, colonialism, and reparation. Nicola is also one of the leading colleagues here at Edinburgh who is taking the decolonizing the curriculum forward. She's going to talk to us today about her project, so researching the legacies of African enslavement and reparatory justice. So Nikki, over to you.
Thanks, Marion. Right, I'm just going to try and share my screen. Hopefully you should all still be able to see me. Can you still see me as well, or is it just the slides?
No, we can see you.
Oh, okay, okay, all right. And the slides as well?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. All right, thanks so much, Marion, and thanks to the AUPHF Plus for inviting me here today. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about my research, but I'm hoping to tell you also about the INOSAR as well, to tell you about the history of the creation of the INOSAR, the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations, and to kind of use that as an example of decolonising practice and research, as well as community engagement and cognitive justice. And by cognitive justice, I mean kind of the equity of all knowledges. So in terms of structure, there's 4 parts, more or less. So the first part is just a bit of background research about, information about my research into the legacies and memories of African enslavement, moving towards reparations. And then I'm going to look at my engagement with reparations activists within a UK context. And then in the third part, look at how we put together or started building this, this network from 2017 onwards, and then how we've sustained and developed our network and how it's moving in future directions. So that's the basic plan for this presentation. Okay, so just to begin with, my interest in the memory and legacies of African enslavement within the context of French history was triggered in 2011, which frighteningly is 10 years ago, which was also the 10-year anniversary of the Loi Taubira. We've just had the 20-year anniversary a couple of days ago. And the Loi Taubira was a law that recognized, and this is a quotation from the law itself, slavery and slave trade as crimes against humanity. And that led every year since 2006, there's been a commemoration on the 10th of May. So in that year, 2011, with Sarkozy in power, at the Jardin de Luxembourg, a group of activists, which are on the slide at the top there, called the Brigade Anti-Negrophobie, or the Anti-Negrophobia Brigade, were physically removed by the Parisian police for wearing the t-shirts that you can see there. They were simply peacefully demonstrating, but they were overtly stating that there's a racial issue within France that needs addressing. So they were thrown out of the Jardin de Luxembourg. I attempted to get into the Jardin de Luxembourg, but couldn't because I didn't have a ticket and was too naive to realize that I needed one. So I went along with the activist photographed there to a conference in the UNESCO building, which was also about celebrating the gains of the Loi Taubira. But within the auditorium, there was an enormous amount of frustration that despite the recognition that this was a crime against humanity, nothing had really changed in terms of colonial power structures. And I was listening to all of the frustrations around me being expressed in the room on that day. And I started to formulate questions of my own about how we can understand commemoration and state recognition from the perspectives of those who live with the legacies of these histories and the activists in particular. And then how do we get sort of a critical reading of the limitations of what the Republic can provide in terms of memory, identity and social justice. So I began in 2014, or a little bit before that really, but interviewing many activists and artists and kind of developing listening skills and methods for interviewing that move more and more into kind of just a process of conversation, finding out more about my positionality as well within all of this. And the more I spoke to activists in particular, the more I developed an awareness of the importance of reparations as a concept and a practice. And the less it became about imposing my research questions that I had to start off with, and the more it became about kind of asking what research questions were of interest to those who were participating in the research. And understanding that kind of memories of African enslavement were a vehicle for engaging with broader societal issues and social justice in the French Republic today. So one of the things that I've been focusing on for a while now is the extent to which reparations is a concept that's misunderstood. It's habitually seen as a paycheck to be paid to individuals, rather than as a holistic practice that requires a self and structural repair. And there's a huge disconnect between how reparations are represented in the press and in political discourse, and how activists are talking about reparations as a practice. And it's a gap that I feel is willed. It's like a willed ignorance on the part of the press and the state. So I started with memory, and I moved quickly into reparations as a legitimate concept that's repeatedly being delegitimized and made into a taboo when it's, you know, part of, it should be an integral part of understanding what a crime against humanity is. Okay, so I'll just change slides. So in 2014, I met Professor Joyce Hope Scott, who's a professor in African American Studies, then at Wheelock College, now in Boston University, at a conference on reparatory histories at Brighton University. And this was a major, we decided that we were going to set up our own kind of conference dedicated specifically not to reparative histories, but to the question of reparations. And we organised that in 2015 at the University of Edinburgh, where I just started working. And the name of that conference was Repairing the Past, Imagining the Future, Reparations and Beyond. And we had participants from all over the place, including Sir Hilary Beckles, who is the chair of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, who was at the time developing the 10-point plan, demanding that European powers engage with a process of reparatory justice, as well as Professor Vereen Shepherd, and a number of other major reparation theorists from the USA and scholars from Europe. We also had activists and artists there. And about 2 weeks before we were due to start the conference, Joyce and I received an open letter published by the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe that voiced concerns about the asymmetrical power relations at work whenever academics working within elite institutions engage with the question of reparations. So they welcomed the invitation in the conference, but they were deeply critical of its format. For example, it was a fee-paying conference that prohibited access for people to actually come to the conference. And one of the things that stood out in that open letter that they sent to us was this quotation here, that any exploration of an issue in academic spaces that refuses to acknowledge and enable adequate representation of the knowledge systems and perspectives of the majority of people who experience the subject matter being dealt with can only result in cognitive injustice. So they draw on what Chowdhury explains as the tendency of professionalized experts or university-based intellectuals to ignore, render invisible, or overwrite the voices, ideas, and indeed theories produced by those engaged in social struggles. So I was really struck by the important message that they were communicating about cognitive injustice and the need to center the work of social struggles. So they emphasised the need to create a more egalitarian space for knowledge exchange and collaboration, one that would, to quote Croto, Hoynes and Ryan, recognise how power and inequality shape context by understanding how academics situated within powerful institutions are inevitably implicated in the social inequalities that result. So Joyce and I responded positively to their criticisms. You know, we removed the fee, we provided greater space within the programme for activists to voice their concerns, but this was obviously just a kind of a beginning. And as a result, many UK-based activists were able to attend. And the important part of this conference, and why I spent so much time on it, is because it concluded with a roundtable. And in that roundtable, we came up with a list of recommendations, including the need for funding to ensure that the type of interaction that was just starting to take place, that was breaking down and addressing those relationships between academics and activists, could continue in the future. So it was our collective desire to build or perhaps mend the bridges between academics and activists and confront those underlying tensions between these communities head on that led to the creation of the INASAR. And as luck would have it, in 2016, the AHRC put out a call for proposals to their research networking grant scheme to, this is a quotation from the call, address research issues of relevance to or raised by the International Decade for People of African Descent, and with the potential to broadly contribute to the aims of the UN Decade, meaning its 3 pillars of recognition, development and justice. So we put together a proposal for that with the activists, notably with Parko and Esther Stanford-Kose and Kofi Mawuli-Klu, but there were also many others involved in that process as well. And we were one of 11 projects that received funding, which is highly significant because I'm sure Charles will talk about it, but Charles has also produced a report with Esther from Parko and one of the INASAR's co-founders about their contribution to the UN Decade as something of an exception in the UK at the moment. Okay, so that's where the INASAR kind of started. We got funding to organise 4 events in Brixton and Birmingham, both in the UK, then Gorée Island in Senegal and Porto Novo in Benin in West Africa. And each of those events was intended to deal with different aspects of how we contribute to the broader movement and how we build our network. So I think it's worth pointing out that we're not sort of a lone wolf, but we're part of a much bigger process and social movement, the International Social Movement for African Reparations, or the ISMAR, and the People's Reparations International Movement, or the PRIM. So there was a sense from the outset, of emphasising that our work is accountable to these movements. It's about recognising the work that has gone before us and ensuring that what we're doing is contributing to that movement and is being driven in some way by those overarching aims. So we wanted to create a space in which to establish enduring international knowledge exchange partnerships between scholars and activists working on African reparations, including members of the youth, and through this support the existing movements that are out there. So the INASAR became or was envisaged as something of playing something of an advocacy role for reparations and challenging a lot of those misconceptions about what reparation actually means. So our first event was in Brixton. And this explored and addressed tensions between scholars and activists, and it was pretty heated, but it was really necessary. And one of the main things that came out of that was a document that is our founding document, and it's called Our Principles of Participation. And again, it's based on that concept of cognitive justice, that we need to have all voices being heard and all knowledges and systems of knowledge given equal weighting. At Birmingham, we explored the challenges of building international solidarities between scholars and activists working in the UK and in other areas of the world. At Gorée Island, we joined activists from the French Caribbean and West Africa in commemorating African enslavement. And then our final international conference was in Porto Novo in Benin, and that brought together a number of people from the Caribbean, from Abia Yala, North America, from Europe, from West Africa. And it resulted in the Porto Novo Declaration calling on African states to institutionalize and advocate the claim for reparatory justice. So again, that wasn't something that we came up with, it emerged out of the conference. It was a request specifically from Sir Hilary Beckles to contribute to the ISMAR, to the International Social Movement. And it was signed off by His Majesty, His late Majesty, Kapoto Zunme Hakpon III, on behalf of the Beninese Council of Kings. So it can be used now by CARICOM and others as leverage to gain support in other African nations. So that was kind of the end of our grant. We wrote a number of reports, created some documentaries and put together the website. And I think there were a huge number of lessons that we learned through this, but I'll only give sort of a few brief highlights. First of all, it was how do we deal with structural inequalities? And I think there was, from academics' perspectives, a rejection of the assumption that we're somehow automatically complicit in the system, while recognizing the need for self-reflexivity. And from activist perspectives, it was that research should be, when you're talking about such a sensitive topic, should be accountable at some level to communities of interest, using the mantra, nothing about us without us, especially when dealing with the legacies of crimes against humanity that continue to cause harm to those communities. The second lesson that we learned was about the use and misuse of language, and that it really matters what we say and how we say it. So there were specific concerns around the use of the term slave, for example, or trade, which is why I flagged up that it's the way that the law says it. The loi Taubira uses the word slave trade, and the preferred term is transoceanic trafficking of enslaved Africans. So to continue using words like slave is to continue to perpetuate the violence of that history. And then the third one was about epistemological differences over how to approach the past and construct its meaning. And there were conflicts between kind of the presumption of some kind of singular empirical truth based on Western-centric positivist models versus the existence of multiple relative truths, or a pluriversality based much more on the idea of anti-colonial or decolonizing models. But again, the most important thing that came out of all of this was this concept of cognitive justice, that it's not just about having an equal relationship between scholars and activists in terms of perspective and knowledges, but also about recognizing that there are multiple other equally valid knowledge systems out there, such as the learning that we gain through Afrocentrism, for example, that are repeatedly maligned and excluded from the academic space as a legitimate way of seeing and perceiving and being in the world. Okay, all right. So we completed that work, and then we were kind of left in a situation of, well, how do we develop the NSR? There was such an enormous amount of energy and positivity after the events that we organised, and we wanted to kind of think about how to further define its role and place within the ISMAR as a useful contributor, an active contributor. So lockdown was useful for me, because it's been a really interesting period of growth for us in terms of funding and political engagement and pedagogy. So we managed to get another round of AHRC funding, and I can talk about this work, but not here because I haven't got much time. We also started working really closely with the Green Party in England and Wales on developing a national reparations motion that has come directly out of and is part of a collaboration with UK-based activists, and it comes from the logos up there, the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign. And we were able last year to help the Green Party become the first national political party to develop a motion that was passed to call on the UK Parliament to establish an all-party parliamentary commission of inquiry for truth and reparatory justice. And there are motions that have passed at local levels now in Lambeth, Islington, and most recently Bristol. And now we're working with Birmingham, Lancaster, and Liverpool. So our roles become about, again, that advocacy work, but also about educating councillors about the meaning of the reparations motion, always in collaboration with the activists to whom the motion belongs effectively, and always working in collaboration with local Black African organisations and activist groups. And then from July 2020, we set up a new online roundtable series, which again, our panels always include scholars and activists. Everything's themed differently, but always links back to the question of reparations. So we had one on material culture at the time after the murder of George Floyd and in response to the pulling down of statues. We then had another one on planet repairs, looking at the links to Extinction Rebellion and to the links between reparation and environmental justice and racial justice. We looked at the role of universities and reparations. We looked at miseducation in the curriculum, and our latest one, which was just 2 weeks ago, was on the question of reparations, land and dispossession. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up there. I just wanted to conclude with a quotation that Kweku Bonsu, who was one of the attendees at the Brixton workshop, came out with in that initial event, and it's taken from the Hosea the sacred wisdom of ancient Egypt and cited in Molanga Karenga. And it's this: be not arrogant because of your knowledge. Take counsel with the ignorant as well as the wise. For the limits of knowledge in any field have never been set and no one has ever reached them. Wisdom is rarer than emeralds, yet it is found among the women who gather at the grindstones. And I love that quotation because it means recognizing the existence and validity of multiple forms of knowledge and becoming open, as Bembe reminds us, to other epistemic possibilities that will necessarily affect the lens through which history in the present day are read and interpreted, as well as our academic research practices. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for an absolutely fascinating paper. And I think, you know, it's really extremely interesting to see this collaboration between activists and academics who drive forward social change, and how this can actually intersect with other struggles, with environmental justice and also with other justice movements. So that was absolutely wonderful. Now, can I encourage our colleagues to put questions in the chat? And whilst you're thinking about questions, maybe I can just start us off. Nikki, I know you're also involved with precisely this question of, you know, the role of universities and universities and colonialism. Obviously, there's a lot going on at the moment, a lot of questioning going on in different universities. And I was wondering whether you could tell us maybe a little bit about that, what is happening either at the University of Edinburgh, what is happening more widely perhaps in the UK in terms of universities.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been kind of a different things that have been going on. There's been the decolonise, the curriculum, decolonise, the academy, all those kind of movements which are student-led, which has been brilliant because there's so much power in the student voice to kind of push things forward and make these changes. And I think that's, if you kind of look over the last 5-6 years, there's been sort of different responses to that from different institutions. And sometimes the institutions have had a, you know, quite a reactionary response, shall I say, and have not wanted to do anything about that. But I think through persistent pressure that is bringing together different constituents, and that's the power that lies within. So when you get students together, working with activists, working with academics, and working collaboratively to try and bring about change. And I think, unfortunately, the murder of George Floyd has also you know, kick-started a huge reckoning really among universities that are in some ways floundering and grappling with what they should do. I mean, I can't speak to, I have interviewed other colleagues who are working in their own respective institutions about particularly how does an institution engage with questions of the money they received or profits indirectly, beneficiaries, for example, linked to the enslavement of African peoples. So there have been different responses to that. There's been the Glasgow case, for example, that produced a report looking at the beneficiaries, and it was quite an economically focused report, and that then kind of came up with an agreement with CARICOM and the University of the West Indies to raise £20 million in funding to set up a centre and sponsor scholarships. So that's been kind of one model, if you like, which is quite a top level model. It's sort of institutions speaking to institutions at the very top of the tree. What we're trying to do in Edinburgh, because I'm involved in that work, how does Edinburgh engage with its legacies of colonialism and African enslavement, and particularly its legacies of racialization, is think about how do we build those constituents, bring them together so it's a collaborative effort, and so that it has buy-in from people from the bottom up as well as the support of the top down, because that's the only way you're going to ever get proper change. If you just have it kind of like parachuted in from the top, it never works, and there'll be, you know, negative responses. So that's very briefly some of the things. But yeah, I think now is the time that things are really beginning to move and change, and it's good to see.
Thank you, Nikki. No, we had one question which was actually, this is Saskia, this is a great work. Do you have a website? Yes, there is a website, actually, we've already indicated it. Any other questions for Nikki? Does anybody have any comments, any questions? Well, I'm very happy to continue this conversation.
Sorry.
Everybody else is thinking now. Also, Nikki, you were talking, and I found that really, so important for decolonizing the curriculum and for our practices, the equally valid knowledge systems, and that we need to acknowledge, recognize equally valid knowledge systems. And I wonder how this can actually be brought into our teaching practice, into our pedagogy. Have you got any advice here?
Yeah, I mean, I was really thinking about that during Nadia's presentation, and I think that she absolutely hit the nail on the head when she talked about interdisciplinarity and the importance of kind of learning across. It's kind of a colonial structure to keep everyone in their geographical boundaries or within their kind of limited knowledge systems. And I mean, not just in terms of Western-centric knowledge systems, but also within our subject areas. So I think kind of breaking down those barriers and, for example, envisaging a place where we're working perhaps with institutions across the world on courses, that would be amazing. So if I'm teaching a course on, I don't know, let's say I'm teaching a course on reparations, and I could have kind of activists talking to my students from different organizations in West Africa or in the Caribbean, that kind of thing, where you can bring in people who have both the experience and knowledge and are able to look at it, decenter that perspective, because I really understood what Nadia said about those. So you see those student essays coming out and you're like, I'm doing something wrong with the teaching. And I think, recognize that I'm a white Western woman trying to teach these things, and, that doesn't carry enough weight. It really doesn't. And, bringing in these other voices that can explain from a much more powerful position of experience. I mean, I'm experienced in terms of like working with activists, but I'm not experienced in terms of physically living this. So I think that's really important, that the university walls of knowledge break down more, and we can have a much more open place where we're engaging with all kinds of different knowledge systems. I mean, my particular interest is in systems, African systems of knowledge. So I'd like to see that, building cross disciplines, having people who can come and speak to that and work within our institution who can speak to that. So that would be, an initial response.
That sounds absolutely wonderful and so crucial. We've got a question from Ruth Bush. Ruth?
Oh, thanks, Marion. Actually, you asked the question I was about to ask about how this research informs your teaching. So
okay, thank you, Ruth. We've also got a follow-on question from Saskia. Do you see yourself as a French studies researcher? How do you feel your methods sit within the discipline?
That's a really good question. No, I feel like a sore thumb. I think I started off when I was doing my my PhD. My PhD was a comparative. Thanks, Saskia. My PhD was a comparative anyway, so it was looking at kind of British, French colonial systems of knowledge and how they kind of construct each other based on the late great Professor Kate Marsh's work, looking at kind of rival coloniality. So I was already working in a comparative way, and I think the work that I do with activists now is also, I work in sort of French Republican context, and then I work very deeply on a daily basis with activists here in the UK. So there's always kind of those two different languages going on inside my head, and systems of knowledge production as well. And I think that post-colonial studies is fine on one level, but there aren't a lot of French and Francophone studies does still remain, this isn't a criticism, but it does still remain sort of about literature and film and those kind of things. So I think I'm usefully positioned in my ability to teach kind of more of the social science type topics, which is where I find my more natural home. But I do have that kind of literary background as well. But yes, little bit of a sore thumb at times. Thank you.
Any other questions? Now, Nikki, you said at the outset, and I think this is really important as well, that the concept of reparations is often misunderstood. Yeah. is not just about paying money to make good, as it were. It's something much, much more complex. And can you maybe tell us a little bit more about, the different forms that reparatory justice can take? And to what extent, I was just wondering, because there's this whole debate obviously going on as well about, the return of artworks in France, the UK, is currently going on in Germany, all over the world. To what extent, is that also part of, the work which you were doing?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think very, very much so, because as our kind of roundtables that we've been running since June last year show, is trying to highlight the different ways we can put a reparative lens on all kinds of different things that are going on. So it might be that decolonising the curriculum can be seen as a reparative process. So that's one, but it's not about just kind of like badging things as reparations. It has to involve communities. It's a social justice concept. It has to involve the communities who continue to suffer the harms of these histories and place their voices at the centre of it, so they're part of the process of directing that change. So reparations is about, is commonly misunderstood as a paycheck, and a paycheck to individuals, which is politically useful because it means that the government can dismiss it as A, an impossible amount of money, B, how on earth do we know that everybody, these specific people are descended from, et cetera, et cetera. And then in the French government's case, it becomes about, well, you're racializing people. So, there's all these different kind of ways that it can be reduced. But when we look at reparations as a holistic concept, it can be attached to multiple different things. So for example, if we're looking at knowledge, let's say that, how do we repair knowledge systems? Well, one might be, just as Nadia said, it's not about throwing all the old archives out and bringing all these new archives in, but it might be about how do we put these archives into a wider context where actually there's a vast amount of knowledge that came out of Africa that has been dismissed or written over, or all of these kind of things. How do we see the sort of value and revalorize those knowledge systems? And that's automatically going to start shifting our cultural perspectives. So that's one example. A lot of reparationists talk about the need for self-repair in terms of, understanding their psychological and physical disconnection from the African continent, and how do they repair those links. And part of what we're doing in terms of our follow-on funding is looking at the concept of rematriation, or how do you return culturally and spiritually to the African continent, as well as the difficulties of repatriation. How do you get a visa? How do you kind of get land? So the other thing that, is central to the idea of reparation is land. And land, as my understanding of it has been developing, is also a spiritual question and an ancestral one, because you were automatically given the right to land, which you now don't have any ownership of because of the history of being displaced from the African continent out to various parts in the world. So there's loads of different angles to it. So to reduce it to monetary payment, it just throws out everything else that is so complicated and vital and important. And the other thing is, of course, this concept of planet repairs, which is partly to do with the idea of, there's this idea of separation of man and nature, whereas a reparative look at this would be the fact that we are one. There is no separation between man and nature, or in other perspectives would suggest that we are part of nature, so we need to kind of take care of the world because we are the world, those kind of things. So there's all sorts of different ways and all sorts of different angles you can take, but to reduce it to a paycheck is deeply problematic.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions? We still have a couple of minutes. No, the conversation continues between me and Nikki. That's absolutely fine. Nikki, maybe just one sort of last question, which is again about university collaboration, I suppose. I think what is linking to a certain extent is really, the kind of much larger collaborations which we'd like to see with universities in Africa, but also scholarships for African students to study here in the UK. There's some, but definitely not enough. Is that also something your network is looking into? Is that part of reparatory justice possibly as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that I'll be interested to see when we do these consultations that we're hopefully going to start fairly soon in our own institutions, the recommendations of people in terms of what they consider an appropriate reparatory justice agenda would look like. And I would hope that that would be part of it. The need to have more open exchanges that are not kind of financially prohibitive between different students, and the ability, as I said, kind of to break down those walls and welcome people from all different communities in. And also a lot of the things that Professor Tommy Curry has been pointing out. So he's the scholar of professor in African American studies working at the University of Edinburgh, and he talks about the importance of creating a climate within a university in which people feel welcome and are able to thrive, and that being something that's really, really key. And how do we address that? How do we hold universities accountable for these issues as well? Because it's all very well saying, okay, we've got these fantastic ideas, but it can quickly become a talking shop. So how do you hold universities accountable to ensuring that they're doing what they said that they're going to do in a positive way? I mean, how do you hold departments accountable through systems of reward? These are some of the things that we are thinking of at the moment, and we're hoping to think, you know, with everybody else as well. Yeah. Brilliant.
Now, we've got a question from Nadia. Nikki, can you speak about any resistance you've encountered to your work in teaching within the university academia?
Do you know, I have been really fortunate. I'm trying to think how to put this. No, because I think that perhaps this project just came at the right time, and I haven't really had any issues in terms of being able to teach what I wanted to teach, gaining the support, financial and time-wise, to try and do what I wanted to do. I've also been fortunate in terms of gaining grants and things. There's been resistance within activist communities, certainly. I think sometimes it can be difficult, like gaining trust from people. That's a long-term project. I think some of the difficulties are practical ones, like paying people. That's, but you know, whatever, I'm not going to go into that. But there can also be difficulties in terms of the, let's say, like the tensions between the impact agenda on one hand, which is kind of a finite thing, and then me as a researcher working with activists as a long-term lifetime commitment. So those kind of things. So yeah, it's taken a long while to build up trust between people. And now that I have built up that trust and we work together so well, it's about ensuring that those relations continue to continue on the path that they are doing, which I would hope would be the case. So I suppose resistance hasn't been from within my own institution. In terms of, sorry, I'm just like now thinking, there has been resistance higher up the tree. We have been lobbying for a really long time to get the university to engage in its history of colonialism and African enslavement. That's starting to pay off now, but that has been a really long battle. I mean, like a 6-year battle that we're starting to now finally get people in place in post to do something about it. So there's a lot of nervousness about how an institution, you know, perceives and portrays itself externally in terms of its brand. So there's those kind of questions that is where you find the resistance. And of course, within certain sectors of the academic community, there is a huge resistance to the idea of changing names to buildings, for example, or, you know, to engaging with these questions which are perceived as very difficult questions. So yeah, there's those kind of resistances, which I know I'm going to face a lot more of in the next couple of years. So I might come back to you and have a lot more to say about all of this.
Now we've got one last question, and then I think we need to wrap up this session. A question from Andy. This may be way off the topic, but I wondered how you have interpreted what Emmanuel Macron seems to be trying to do in Algeria around the Stora report, not apologizing for history, but working to open up archives, for example. don't know, Nicola, whether you've got any thoughts.
Okay, I don't know whether I'm the person who's best placed to speak to this, because I don't work on Algeria, although I am, of course, aware of the Stora report. But I think that that kind of circumnavigation of an apology is typical political discourse and strategy. It's like recognizing and then jumping to reconciliation without kind of doing the hard work, which is the middle piece, which is reparation. So it's kind of all of this posturing on the one hand without actually doing the deep structural work that needs to be done. So yeah, it's good to see that the archives are being opened up, but I think this is the direction, reparatory justice is the direction that things are heading in at the moment. So, I mean, Emmanuel Macron was at the 10th of May commemoration for the abolition of slavery 2 days ago and didn't even sort of say anything. He was silent. So that was also very problematic. So yeah, I've got like certain ideas about Emmanuel Macron, but perhaps he's not the best place to say them.
Okay, well, maybe that's the moment to wrap up this session. So thank you very much again, Nikki, for such an absolutely inspiring presentation. We've got 5 minutes and then we're going to continue with Ruth at 3:30. So we'll just have a little breather, just a couple of minutes.
it's just come past. Martin, would you like us to start again? And Ruth, if you have any PowerPoint as the next speaker, if you would like to upload it, please do go ahead.
Yeah, ready when you are. So yeah, let's just crack on.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe whilst Ruth is sharing her screen, I will introduce her. So we're very pleased to have as our next speaker Ruth Bush. So she is a senior lecturer in French and comparative literature at the University of Bristol, and her research concerns African and diasporic literature, literary and cultural production, with a particular interest in material print cultures, translation, and decolonial practice. Her first book was Publishing Africa in French, Literary Institutions and Decolonisation, published with Liverpool University Press in 2016. And her next book, Translation Imperatives, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. She has published the history of the New Beacon Books, the UK's first radical Black bookshop and publishing house. And she has co-produced an exhibition and digital resource about a pioneering Senegalese women's magazine, Awa, La Revue de la Femme Noire. She is currently working on 2 collaborative research projects, one about literary translation with Cameroonian literary collective Bakwa, and the other an ERC-funded project, The Creative Lives of African Universities, with partners in Senegal, Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire, and Benin. Thank you very much, Ruth, for your presentation.
Thanks very much. And thank you for this very kind invitation. And yeah, my brief for the presentation was not to give a research presentation, but something more practical in its discussion of research and pedagogy. And I think I've wound up with something that falls in between those 2 poles. So we'll see how we go. But I do think that it picks up on several aspects of the previous 2 presentations, and particularly the discussion of engaging with Global South scholars and institutions. And I wanted to say that this obviously builds from ongoing and collective conversations with students and with colleagues and with the kind of other national events that have taken place at the IMLR recently, as well as in particular with conversations with collaborators from beyond the university. So a lot of work and conversation with literary activists based on the African continent, and also here in Bristol over the past 5 years, involvement in developing our MA programme in Black Humanities, which I'll say a little bit about briefly in the presentation. But to kick things off, I want to start with this quotation from the memoir of Binyavanga Wainaina, the late and I think very great Kenyan writer. And he writes, "While I was in A-levels, somebody gave me a copy of Decolonising the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o and fancied myself an intellectual. The book impressed me because it used words like decolonising, a very satisfying word. Like a squeegee on a dirty dorm floor, it promised to leave things squeaky clean. We are not messy people, it said. You can pull a completely unpolluted person out of the mush." I was terribly impressed. So I decided to name myself with Gikuyu correctness. I find this tongue-in-cheek description of decolonising very helpful in current messy times. It's a useful text to reread with students alongside Ngugi's foundational 1986 book, Decolonising the Mind, which, for anyone who doesn't know, it is about the politics of writing in African languages in African literary production. And Wainaina's self-mocking naivety here is subverting Frantz Fanon's well-known description of decolonisation in Les Damnés de la Terre, where Fanon talks about it being a programme of désordre absolu. My students often seem to find the word decolonising satisfying, especially over the past year or so, but I think for different reasons and at times with a healthy degree of scepticism. Here, Wainaina's images of hygiene and of pollution evoke a youthful yearning for rapid change and for a form of visible cleansed purity. This articulated promise of change is one which is rooted in language and naming practices in Kenya. Wainaina's memoir grapples with some of the consequences of such a process of decolonising the mind. He explores notably throughout his memoir the risks of replacing this colonial mush with forms of ethnocentric nationalism. And there have been similar kind of discussions around Ngugi wa Thiong'o's recuperation of Gikuyu. The varied processes then of Africanization, which took place in African schools and universities in the 1960s and 70s, continue, I think, to have important lessons for current discussions of decolonising education, not least in the forms of avid futurity that they projected and how they negotiated institutional legacies of colonialism. And for us and our students today, this latest iteration, this latest phase of decolonisation, of course, decolonisation is a process which has been going on for hundreds of years, continues to be messy and complicated. It's steeped in political polemics relating to history and memory. It will take much longer, and I think certainly beyond my own lifetime, and involve more effort than this damp squeegee on a grimy floor. As Wainaina goes on to note, the problem with decolonising is that it reveals you to be undecolonisable. So my starting point really is to say that in educational contexts, decolonising is an approach to knowledge production, one which is self-aware regarding tacit hierarchies of knowledge and value, one which is open to plural forms of knowledge, this idea of a pluriversity, of epistemic diversity that Nikki's already touched on, of cognitive justice. It is engaged in forms of reparation, and it is necessarily humble in attitude. This decolonising approach is not something with a clearly measurable endpoint. It's not a tick box exercise. The decentering of French studies then, as Nadia's already said, is a familiar topic and one which has also been formative in my own academic training. For several decades, post-colonial and transnational theories and methodologies have hugely enriched and expanded critical study of the French language, as well as the literatures, histories, politics and cultures of the French-speaking world. The centre-periphery model has been joined and sometimes displaced by the helpfully amorphous idea of francosphère, informed by concepts of métissage, globalisation, créolité, world literature, critical race theory, and overtly materialist and institutional approaches to understanding cultural production. The study of these francospheres is no longer defined by a centrifugal colonial metropole or uncritical accounts of French Republican values and so on. I think it's important to say that these francospheres are multilingual in nature, if not in name. As Charles Fosdick argues in a 2010 chapter entitled On the Abolition of the French Department, and that's another play on a path-breaking text by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, his text from 1968 on the abolition of the English department. Charles writes in that text, in that chapter, about how transnational French studies engages with asymmetrical institutional histories and the super complexity of contemporary societies. And we've seen how this is played out through the Transnationalising Modern Languages project, and how it's having further implications for our conceptualization of languages as a robust and explicitly interdisciplinary field. I was struck in the call for today's event by this appeal to make the curriculum relevant for a diverse and student and academic body. And this is something that we've been talking about here in Bristol, which I don't think my Bristol colleagues will mind me saying is not a very diverse student or academic body. So I think one thing that I wanted to add here is a kind of qualification to what may appear to be a presentist tendency in the current decolonial turn, and to note, building on conversations with my colleagues Marianne Ailes and Rowan Tomlinson, the complexity of medieval and early modern societies and culture, and the scope of French studies in contributing to scholarship and teaching in that area. And I'm thinking here, you know, this has been in the news, Leicester's move to cut medieval posts in English, for example, in order to strengthen their decolonial provision. Any decolonial curriculum benefits from a long historical lens and critical reflection on the omissions inherent in history and memory work. I noticed that Etienne Smith was here earlier. I don't know if he's still here, but Etienne and Charles and Lydie Modelenio's book, Postcolonial Realms of Memory, is a really useful teaching resource for engaging with those questions in a Francophone context. But this long historical lens enables students to understand the complexity of the colonial dynamics of extraction, violence, and resistance. And it also prevents the appropriation of medieval and Renaissance periods, particularly by alt-right and white supremacist bodies. I won't read out this quotation, but I'm leaning here on Melissa Sanchez's recent article, Woke Renaissance Studies in English Literary Renaissance. And I think that this has valuable implications for how our students learn to conceptualize temporality and human and non-human coexistence in the contemporary world, and to think critically about developmental Eurocentric logics of coloniality and modernity. So again, going back to that conceptual toolkit that Nadia was talking about. To talk, moving into the second part, about my position here in Bristol. This is a city where the toppling of the statue of Edward Colston during the Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd last summer has reopened cracks. And these are cracks that I think are allowing gradual structural change to seep in. The university swiftly moved to action. It highlighted the ongoing research of Professor Olivette Otele on the university's connections to transatlantic slavery. It set up a £1 million scholarship fund for Black students. A new anti-racist steering group and decolonising the curriculum steering group were convened. Alongside these rapid top-down moves to innocence, to use Tuck and Yang's expression, a bottom-up amalgamation of staff and student decolonising working groups has emerged. So again, it's that bottom-up, top-down dynamic. They're exerting pressure on everything from recruitment and widening participation to the names of buildings, and proposing this Banksy-inspired temporary redesign of the university's crest that you can see on the bottom right of your screen. The original crest, which is still the one being used, features Colston's family emblem, the dolphin. These changes, of course, didn't come from a vacuum. The student-led Why Is My Curriculum White campaign was very active on campus in 2015, stirred by the fallist movements in South Africa and in Oxford. One further recent dimension of this has been a kind of release of resource to support work that's been ongoing and ideas that have been in gestation for a long time. So this enabled the rapid release of this MOOC last year, which is freely available on the FutureLearn platform, and which covers all disciplinary areas in the university, including STEM subjects and a section on modern languages. In my own research in teaching in French and in comparative literature and in Black humanities, I'm constantly reminded of my own linguistic incompetence and the limitations of fluency in too many European languages, as Alison Phipps put it. I am, and I think this speaks to what Nikki described herself as a sore thumb, a slightly awkward fit in a French department, though I feel very at home in a school of languages. I think it's interesting to note the contrast with the States, where Francophone Africa posts invariably now come with an African language requirement. So there's been recent posts advertised for French with Wolof, or French with Lingala, or French with Mandinka. And when I go to African Studies conferences, my disciplinary home department sometimes raises eyebrows or suspicions of a kind of Francocentric myopia. In the classroom, in my year 2 and year 4 classes, if I think about, we always study Ousmane Sembène's films, and this often leads students to ask whether they can study a module on Wolof, the lingua franca of Senegal. In our first year syllabus, all the students study Maryse Condé's novel La Belle Créole alongside sessions on the Haitian Revolution. And we talk about falling statues here in Bristol, but also the statue of Joséphine de Beauharnais in Fort-de-France and the statue of Louis de Faidherbe in Saint-Louis in Senegal. And this leads us to reflect critically on physical and on epistemic violence in relation to history and memory and the nature of these densely multilingual contexts. And I've given those examples because I think that we owe it to our students to be open about the limits of our knowledge and to use such opportunities to invite critical reflection on the historical power inequities that shape linguistic diversity, including here in the UK. I really recommend Rachel Gilmore's book, Bad English, on this topic, which just came out last year. This is an opportunity to expand our pedagogical toolkit by bringing other forms of knowledge into the classroom and other people into the classroom. So the MA Black Humanities, for example, integrates core workshops with artists, campaigners, and writers. So Esther Stanford-Creuset, who Nikki mentioned, came and spoke about reparations last year. We had a session with Lola Shanayan from the Ake Festival, which is the biggest literary festival on the African continent. We had a session online with her. And this opens up the conversation about anti-racist theory and history and practice in really thought-provoking ways, and in ways that I just can't do, as well as the enduring presence of the so-called language question on the African continent. So to state what may seem obvious, it's not just about curriculum diversity, but about the questions that we set out to ask together, thinking about where these questions come from and who gets to formulate them. And this line of thinking has a long tradition within critical pedagogy with people like Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks and others. So the final part of what I'd like to say is about bringing African perspectives into French studies, into our classrooms. According to the Observatoire de la langue française, the majority of the world's French speakers are based on the African continent, where use of French in institutional and everyday multilingual settings varies enormously. As scholars, writers, and the current French president have noted, the future of the French language will be determined in the African space, quelque part entre Kinshasa et Brazzaville, bien plus qu'entre Paris et Montauban, as Macron's speechwriters put it. For French studies, then, this shift invites necessary translingual and transcultural understanding and a process of what Achille Mbembe terms défrancophonisation. It invites critical reflection on institutionalized initiatives such as Macron and Leila Slimani's recently launched Dictionnaire de la Francophonie, as well as engaging with bottom-up appropriations, recycling, and conscious redeployment of French of the type found in many genres of contemporary African literary and cultural expression. So I'm thinking particularly of the use of camfranglais by participants in the Bacqua literary translation workshop, which you can see here. So this hybridized form of French and English. So if the primary practical challenge remains that of whose voices are in the classroom or in the conference room or on the pages of the academic journals that we read, how might we move ahead? And I'm going to say a bit about my current research project, which is just getting it off the ground at the moment. Though I'm not claiming to offer definitive answers, The conversations with colleagues at the 4 universities that are part of this project have been a helpful reminder of the contingencies of decolonising discussions. We had a number of preparatory workshops over the past few years building up to this grant application. Our project, The Creative Lives of African Universities, is exploring cultural representations and lived experiences of university life on the African continent from 1960 to the present day. It bridges comparative cultural studies and the now fairly well-established field of critical university studies. The project seeks new understanding of how these contested institutions have been perceived and experienced creatively within the socio-political contexts of 4 multilingual cities, and thinking about this against contexts of climate emergency, rapid demographic expansion, hypermobility, and a digital revolution. So it's not principally concerned with the hangover of French influence, but rather thinking about these spaces as spaces generating ideas of futurity and living experience of epistemic and linguistic plurality. In these universities, the process of Africanization of the curriculum and staffing has taken place over several decades, and they maintain very large departments of literature and linguistics, including departments of lettres modernes with their own specialists in French metropolitan literature. Material realities in French higher education, in African higher education, present significant challenges to attempts to decolonize at a global scale, however, and to kind of flatten out the conversations that might take place, for example, about French Renaissance literature, but involving scholars based in Dakar who are also working on Montaigne. And these realities include expanding student numbers, so the phenomenon of massification, which means that you might have 30,000 students studying literature and working in and around a building which was designed for about 1,000 students. Serious issues of staff precarity and a huge lack of research resources. So this includes no sabbaticals, in some cases no libraries. For the 2 colleagues based at the Université de Maroua, there are no offices, toilet facilities are very sparse. They also face hostile visa regimes and practices of gatekeeping in international academic publishing. So these material aspects expose in stark relief the asymmetries of a global neoliberal literary culture and the need to build what Sarah Nuttall terms the redistributed university, an idea of the university based on social justice and equal or more equal access to research and pedagogical resources. These kinds of material asymmetries make building meaningful and ethical university partnerships challenging, not least in view of UK universities' strategic commitments to metrics-based academic excellence when it comes to things like internationalisation. Despite difficulties with infrastructure within these African universities, however, the main barriers to engaging with scholars based on the African continent are those of our own institutions here in the UK. Staff and 2-way student exchanges between West Africa and the UK involve substantial commitment to negotiating the hurdles of the UK visa regime. I've had numerous experiences of chasing up the Home Office, writing to the director of the Royal African Society when people's scholars' visas have been rejected. And then, as Nikki alluded to, the processes of paying people, especially advancing sums needed to pay visa costs, or when we're working in cash-based informal economies. And this makes this kind of work very time-intensive. With this in mind, then, I think sharing best practice among colleagues in French studies is a really important way forward for encouraging further future engagement with colleagues and institutions based in the Global South. And I noticed that Tony Chafer was here and David Murphy as well, and I'm really grateful for the advice that I've had from them along the way. And here are then 3 kind of takeaway suggestions by way of a conclusion. Firstly, mitigating the digital divide. The digital divide is real, but there are things that can be done to mitigate it. So in the era of COVID, online conferencing and Zoom meetings and so on have transformed the nature of my research, certainly. And this is despite unstable connectivity, particularly in Benin, and very high data costs on the continent. I think as we start to plan events over the coming years, thinking about pre-recording presentations or accepting pre-recorded presentations for conferences would be helpful, and also covering costs involved in data transfer. And these costs are not huge, but they can be embedded into our planning and into our grant applications. Secondly, further practical support for Africa-based scholars, including research residencies and writing workshops, but when developing these, to involve those scholars in the process, and especially when it comes to thinking about selection criteria, which tend to be based on the metrics of what has already been published. That these kinds of workshops can be mutually transformative, as we've seen with things like the British Academy sponsors writing workshops. The publishing side of things I won't go into, but of course open access publishing is essential. And then when it comes to peer review, Carly Kurtzia has a wonderful article on the ethics of journal work and the need to move conversations beyond the air-conditioned rooms of conference, the air-conditioned conference rooms of the global north. But I think being mindful when it comes to processes of peer review, recognising disparity in library resources, offering PDFs wherever possible, and expanding the methodological remit of what is accepted for publication will be important steps ahead. And lastly, but by no means least, I think the possibilities of online student exchanges is an area for further reflection. Bristol, along with a number of other UK universities, Cardiff in particular, took part in a recent pilot online student language exchange programme, which you can see the poster here. It was led by this app, Billy, and it was funded by the British Council. And we had a student exchange between Bristol and the Université Abdou-Moumouni in Niger. And there is possibility here for co-developing teaching resources which integrate language and cultural exchange, or literary and historical content. I mean, Billy is simply the platform, and the idea is that the activities are co-developed by the staff as part of the units. And I think that this could really be quite transformative and make the most of mobile phone ubiquity on the continent. So I'd welcome colleagues' thoughts on that. So those are just 3 practical steps to be taken alongside critical reflection on the idea of the redistributed university. And I've put a longer quote from Sarah Nuttall's essay there, that this reflection on who occupies university structures, how and to what end, and then in turn deepening our reflection on the extent to which knowledge is or remains circumscribed by institutions and singular disciplines. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't go too over time.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for this very interesting presentation where you have covered the stakes and the traps of decolonization, and also look both at the changing teaching context, at your own research, and then here on this final slide on the areas for action in the redistributed university. We have a couple of questions and comments in the chat, which we maybe can go to first, and then there is time for some further questions if anyone wants to add a question. The first question is by Julia Waters. Julia, I can read out your question, but you're very welcome to ask it yourself if you would prefer.
Oh, thank you. Hello, Ruth, and hello, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, my question was, I said it's a practical one, really. As you will know, Ruth, both of us being members of the Society for Francophone Post-Colonial Studies, and we've been trying to do some work to increase and to make our membership more inclusive. And I'm just finding it really kind of hard to know the kind of practical steps that we can make. It's very much to sort of make pronouncements. We have, I know after the last AGM you and I discussed, we have offered free membership to scholars and institutions from the global south and so on, but actually, you know, how we can reach out to decolonize our learned societies in a way. Still our membership is very much global north, Anglophone. I don't know if you know, some of the, I've been noting down all sorts of things for both yours and Nikki's papers that were fantastic, but I mean, going beyond curricula and the university, really.
Yeah, I think that step to make membership free was a really important decision. It's still quite recent days since that decision was made.
Yeah.
So I think there's still a work of diffusing that message and making people aware. I know the next annual conference is going to be online. So I'll certainly be sending it to networks. I think making sure the CFPs are bilingual, I think we already did that anyway, but making sure also thinking about the mailing lists that they go on.
Maybe, you know, we can carry on that, but I think it's, you know, lots of the talk about decolonising is about the curriculum, is about the institution, but actually, you know, AU, PHF and others, we work as scholars in different networks and so on, isn't it? How we can work differently to increase accessibility more broadly, I think. But I think that a lot is already being done. I'm just impatient. Force people either, so people obviously have a right to disconnect and to engage in other networks and so on. But there does tend to be a tendency to, I mean, the Francophone universities, their connections to the Anglophone world are quite limited. I mean, I always go to the African Literature Association conference. It's one of the biggest, and it's, you know, the quality of papers is always excellent. There's so few Francophone panels or French language panels, and it's such a shame. Yeah. So anyway, but there are other questions. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I think the second question in the chat also goes a bit in that direction of obstacles. It's a question from Nadia Kiwan. I don't know if Nadia wants to phrase or voice her question, or else I'll just read it out. Go ahead if you like.
Yeah, I was just typing a question. I didn't realize it had gone through yet. Yeah, you were calling on me, Francisco. Yeah, sorry. So I was in the middle of writing, but I'll just read out what I was writing. So thank you very much, Ruth. That was a wonderful paper. I'm really I've learned a lot actually. But I just wondered if I was glad that you picked up the question of language, actual language learning, and I think you refer to how many posts, say in the US now, ask for sort of mastery of multiple languages, you know, Wolof and French, for example. And I've seen also, you know, Arabic and French and things like that increasingly. And I just wondered if, to bring it back to the UK context, whether you could comment a little bit on how university departments can kind of widen the participation a bit, or sort of promote decolonial language learning when we're in quite a hostile context, you know, in terms of government policy, you know, narrowing down the opportunities to learn foreign languages, you know, imperial European languages, never mind other languages, and where we end up then with a student body which is increasingly within modern languages less and less diverse, actually, in terms of social class, particularly because many of them will come from private schools, fee-paying schools. So yeah, it was just whether you could comment on those.
Yeah, I think this speaks to the importance of ongoing work over decades, really, in the area of heritage languages, or what's sometimes called community languages. And I think the IMLR are having an event actually on that, in that area, later on this year. And I think that you can, though, despite that, always, there are things you can do to register multilingualism within your student body, and, you know, to make visible the number of languages which are present on the campus, for example. And you know, one thing that I've been trying to encourage here in Bristol is to run some sort of small scale pilot around Somali, which was one of the most widely spoken community languages in Bristol, and to offer that as part of our university-wide language provision, and to make a connection with our medical school, who have done amazing work in decolonising their curriculum, but to think how languages can be brought into that curriculum as well. And the medical school have been very open to that proposal. So I think sometimes there can be quite kind of small scale pilot things, and then if it depends then on the take up and the people who are involved. But certainly it's an area where you need people with the right kind of expertise, because we have, you know, within modern languages, people who have excellent language pedagogy skills, but those are skill sets which can be shared as well and developed with people who have other kinds of language knowledges. But I mean, I take your point very much of the pressures on modern languages departments, but I think the onus on that is to therefore rethink, because a decolonised curriculum is a robust curriculum which is suitable for the 21st century. So I think, you know, we have to try and be as brave and as ambitious as possible within the material context that we find ourselves in.
Thank you very much. There are some other comments and very positive comments, I think, on what you are discussing rather than a real question. So maybe to see if, whilst we wait to see if any further questions emerge, perhaps I'll just follow up with one of my own, if I may, because I was wondering, and I think it's an ongoing struggle in this type of work, both for the research and the teaching side, how you avoid kind of slipping back into an asymmetrical structure, and a situation where a situation of extraction from the minority world and closing the loop and going back is also during the kind of partnerships that your students have. How do you share ownership of that with your university partners?
I think being involving the partners, as Nikki said, that ethic of nothing about us without us, involving partners in building the research questions and in building the research methodology, even if that knocks sideways your original intentions, and being very open to a project taking an unexpected direction, or to collaborators and postdocs and so on. Kind of Grace Musila has a wonderful piece on this where she talks about wandering off, you know, accepting that will happen, and that just alters the shape of the project, but that ultimately that's a positive thing. And then being open and talking about ethics. I mean, the ethics process for this grant is a very long one. It's already gone through 2 iterations, and there'll be several more iterations over the next 12 months before we actually begin any research working with students in these institutions. So that's a very rigorous process, but it's also a process which is very fraught, because the Global Code of Ethics for Research in Resource Poor Contexts, which is the ethics code that the ERC recommends us to use, firstly, resource poor is problematic. It really means kind of just poor as in economically poor, and it overlooks the richness of imaginative resources, of knowledges, of intellectual production which is taking place in these spaces. So it can already kind of get partners backs up a little bit. So there's also always a process of negotiation and translation of a document like that, which we have to bring to partners. You know, we had a discussion with the collaborators on Monday about time, about, you know, the expectation that they'll be paid an hourly rate to help postdocs during their fieldwork, and, you know, a long conversation about the notion of time, and that you can't, you know, calculate this is going to take this many time, this is going to take this many hours, because in a context, you know, where Albert in Marois was talking about existential precarity, you know, that there is the notion of time is not the same. So, and I'm going around the houses slightly, but I think it's about listening, and it's about having honest conversations. And you know, those asymmetries are not going away. They still exist. I don't claim that this project is going to, you know, solve all of them. It's just a small step in that direction.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. We can conclude on those notion of small steps, but essential steps. So thank you very much, Ruth, and I'll hand over. I think we are now moving to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again.
Sorry, can I just check? Are we moving to the roundtable discussion now?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry, just to check. Okay, so I'll be chairing the roundtable section of this conference. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome three brilliant speakers to our panel today. We have Rihanna Walcott from Project Myopia, who will be speaking about Project Myopia, but also from King's. And we've got Nicola Boncel from the University of Lausanne and Charles Forsdick from the University of Liverpool. So I'll introduce all of them now so you can get a clear sense of their different disciplines and interests before I pass over to their brief presentations, which I think they've got about 10 minutes each. So I need to be quite strict with the 10 minutes. That's my instruction from on high. So if I begin with Rihanna Walcott, she, her, excuse me. Her is an LAHP funded PhD student at King's College London, researching Black women's identity formation in digital spaces, and a graduate twice over from the University of Edinburgh. She co-founded Project Myopia.com, a website that promotes inclusivity in academia and a decolonised curriculum. She's done some amazing workshops at the university. She frequently writes about feminism, mental health, race and literature for publications including The Wellcome Collection, The Metro, The Guardian, the BBC, Vice and Dazed. She is a co-editor of an anthology about BAME mental health, The Colour of Madness, and in whatever time she's got left over, she moonlights as a professional jazz singer. She tweets at Rihanna_Walcott, and more about her work can be found at rihannawalcott.com. So she's going to speak to us about Project Myopia and what it means to decolonise from student activist perspectives. So that will be a great presentation, I'm sure. Our second speaker is Nicola Boncel, who is a professor at the University of Lausanne, and he's a specialist of the history of colonialism and post-colonialism. He recently published Le Post-Colonialisme with the Presse Universitaire de France in 2020, and also with Dominic Thomas, Pascal Blanchard and Sandrine Lemaire, published Colonial Legacy with Indian University Press in 2019. And last but not least, we have Charles Forsdick, who is James Barrow Professor of French at the University of Liverpool. He's published on a range of subjects, including travel writing, colonial history, post-colonial and world literature, and the memorialization of slavery. His recent books include The Black Jacobin's Reader with Duke University Press, 2016, Toussaint Louverture, Black Jacobin in an Age of Revolution in 2017, Keywords for Travel, Writing Studies with Anthem Press in 2019, and Post-Colonial Realms of Memory, Sites and Symbols in Modern France with LUP in 2020. He's also the co-author of two recent reports, so Common Cause Research, Building Research Collaborations Between University and Black and Minority Ethnic Communities in 2018, which is a really excellent report. I recommend everyone reads that. And the United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent, 2015-2024, Recognition, Justice, Development, Repair, another brilliant report. So thank you. I'm going to hand it over to Rihanna now, if that's okay for you to start. And just to say, they've been given a number of questions around which to focus on, but Rihanna, you're focusing mostly on Project Myopia as well. So let's just start with those and then I'll put the questions afterwards. Thanks.
Hello, so hi, thank you so much for that introduction. So I will just quickly share screen. So I'm going to be walking us through a little bit about Project Myopia, which is a project that I co-founded back in 2017 and is now, as of March, 4 years old. So this is a student-led activity that started while I was in my master's and while I was at the University of Edinburgh, where it received an Innovation Initiative grant, and it is now currently funded by the London Arts and Humanities Partnership. So basically our remit is that we are trying to crowdsource a more diverse curriculum. And we are also looking at these part of these conversations at, you know, lots of different universities across the UK about what it would mean to meaningfully decolonize an institution. Is this something that's possible? Is this something, you know, where should we be focusing our efforts? So I think I'm going to whiz through this very quickly because we have got only 10 minutes, but I do know that I'm sure that we're all very aware of the statistics around this, about student attainment, student achievement, and how marginalized students are much disproportionately likely to achieve lower grades. There are gender imbalances at subject levels, and there are high BAME attainment gaps, particularly when it comes to Black students who receive less first or 2-1s compared to white peers. There are less UKRI funded PhD students. So in 2019, a report from Leading Roots showed that of approximately 19,000 UKRI funded PhDs, only about 200 or 1.2% were Black, and of that number, only 30 are Caribbean, which is a number that I'm part of, and is small enough that we actually have a WhatsApp chat. So this is the kind of environment that we're in. This is the kind of environment that we continue to perpetuate in our education system, and by you know, this kind of environment and the people that are inside it is very much reflective of the kind of education and the kind of academic research that we are producing. So a little bit about Project Myopia. We cross all of these platforms. We have a strong focus on digital engagement because we want to make sure that it's accessible outside of the ivory tower, but also that it's something that's accessible to people on their devices, or, you know, we were way ahead of the curve on this one. So we've got the Twitter presence, a Bookstagram, which does short form recommendations of different creative materials, let's say, and exhibitions and things. And then the main part of the initiative is our website. So the way that it works is that we ask for anyone to write us personal essays between 750 to 1,000 words. And in that piece of writing, they describe and recommend a work. So that work can be anything. This is a little outdated. We're very much an interdisciplinary project, even though we started in the arts and humanities. We also now have expanded to include interviews with people in different fields to talk about, you know, ways of decolonizing subjects that aren't so easy to talk about. So when it comes to arts and humanities and languages and things, I think it's very easy to discuss, you know, the case for decolonization and how we can tackle it. But when it comes to STEM subjects, people tend to be a little bit more flustered. So we are very much trying to ensure that we incorporate that into the conversation. So we ask people to answer these 3 main questions. Why is the work relevant to them? Did they come across these works when they were studying? And if not, how did you come across your chosen work? And then most importantly, we ask people to justify how it fits into a university curriculum, to very specifically answer what kind of course it might be studied on, why it's worthy of study at all. So the whole website works both as a sort of, I guess, apologia, as you know, something that justifies and explains the reasons for the inclusion of non-traditional texts into a curriculum, but also asks for us to consider texts in different ways, and also is very specific about the spaces that they could fit. So as an educator, you can go through the website and say you happen to be teaching any one of these hashtags courses here. Perhaps you're looking to teach a course about modernism down at the bottom. So instead of reaching for the T.S. Eliot, the Ezra Pound, all of the very classic sort of old white men that you would consider indicative of the modernist period, why not go for Quicksand by Nella Larsen, which is very much also an example of the modernist period and style. But because she is a Black author from the Harlem Renaissance, an African-American writer, she tends to get pigeonholed to Black women's writing, Black writing, American writing, you know, rather than really thinking about ways in which this is a cross-genre kind of work. So the examples we have here are just a few of our very early examples, but as I've mentioned, we do now include a lot of other stuff, including things like interviews and things. So we are very much in context with plenty of other works. You know, we've already heard a little bit about things like Why Is My Curriculum Right, White, Roads Must Fall, and things like that. So I'm not going to lean on that too much, but this is just a reminder that we are very much in context with these different organizations. And in fact, I want to say 2 weeks ago, time moves, who'd have thought, we held a conference, a completely online conference, which will be available on our website soon if you'd like to check it out, where we brought together representatives from lots of different universities across the UK to talk about their own experiences of decolonising different spaces. So that's a really cool thing to see if you're interested in seeing the kinds of work that student activists and educators are already doing. So we were very much keen on ensuring that we had these staff-student collaborations, ensuring that people across the, you know, across different points in their career, from student to early career researcher to professor and beyond, that they were all represented in this space, and that we understand that the work of scholar activism, the work of decolonising and changing our institutions is everyone's duty. Because for a long time, it does tend to seem that a lot of the work being done on this happens on the student side of things. A lot of the reason why this project came about was because myself and Toby, as when we started this project, we were going to our English Lit department and saying, what's going to happen, what's going to change, we don't see ourselves represented in this. And a lot of the pushback we were getting was, well, we don't have time to change the curriculum, we don't see how we can do that, how are you going to, you know, we're trying to take off Shakespeare, we can't take Shakespeare off the English Lit course, which is of course never what we were asking. We were just but you know, providing this then became a sort of, well, here is a database, a student created crowdsourced database that we can all use and that we can all add to make it a more collaborative project, rather than it being student demands, staff refuse, or staff demands, higher, other staff refuses. So we also are very keen on understanding and recognizing positionality in academic practice, in demystifying these chains of power and influence and academic hierarchies that are so, you know, that are not transparent to students, that are not particularly transparent, as particularly to first generation students or to marginalized students from backgrounds who haven't got legacies in academia. So every part of our staff are paid, we are funded, we have, well, I won't get into that, but the point is we have funding for now. So we also run these microaggression classroom workshops for teaching assistants on creating an inclusive classroom. So one of the things that we do, as well as thinking about decolonising the curriculum itself, we also think about pedagogy, and then finally we care about pastoral care. So those are the sort of three prongs that we attack in terms of thinking about how we can meaningfully decolonise an institution as far as is possible when you're in the Imperial Centre. So we ask people to consider, if money were no object, how would you redesign the university experience? Because we want people to remove that cap from their imagination about how universities should function. We ask people to think about their own experiences in the classroom. What would they like to see more of? And then we also create an environment where people are able to share classroom practices that were either unsafe or intolerant, and that were handled well or badly, or vice versa, things that were really great in the teaching, sharing best practice about how we can be better informed educators. So some of the examples we have here is, this is how we run it. We've got this trigger warning. Each of these scenarios discusses events in class that went wrong, with instances of racism, sexism, ableism, lack of support for survivors of sexual violence and queer phobia. And we ask everyone to be be inclusive with their own language when they're discussing these scenarios, and think about what went well, what went badly, how was it resolved, could it have been resolved differently, could they have done anything before, during, after class to avoid the situation or turn it into one of those teachable moments. So this example here is about Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and a pretty inappropriate classroom discussion. All of these things are drawn from actual student experiences, from some workshops and focus groups that we run. And we do that because we like to present educators with things that actually happen, so they don't go, oh, that would never happen in my classroom, because it did. And you know, the point is that it isn't a prescriptive workshop, it's that people will come to different conclusions and understand how to navigate these issues. I swear I'm wrapping up. So the decolonisation workshop that we've recently started running is sort of asking these more broad questions as well. We think through what is decolonisation and why should we do it this at different institutions? Why do we talk about decolonisation rather than diversity? What's the difference in, you know, what we're trying to do with our work? Because it does often end up that this work tends to lean towards the tokenistic, lean towards diversifying practices rather than actually getting to the meat of what we want from decolonisation. And then we talk about how it is possible in your field, in your institution, bringing in the more specific stuff. So lastly, if you're interested in getting involved or booking us for a workshop at your institution, please do contact us here at projectmyopia@gmail.com. Here's our website and also our social media links. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. That was great. Really kind of interesting, and like it's great the way you sort of practically you're tackling this in a practical sense as well through the workshops and getting people to discuss issues that can often, or perceived anyway, as being difficult issues to talk about. And thanks for bringing up all those kind of different things about how we meaningfully decolonize as well, because as has been repeated, but as you sort of made abundantly clear, it's not just about a tick box exercise. Thank you so much. If it's okay, I think we'll go through each of the presenters and then we'll have a general discussion. So if I could move on now to Nicola Boncel. Nicola, is that all right if you could give your presentation, sticking to 10 minutes? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. If you are okay, I can present my teach in French, if it's possible, parce que je suis quand même beaucoup plus à l'aise pour parler en français qu'en anglais. Je vous remercie d'abord pour votre invitation et je voulais aussi remercier les différentes présentations parce que j'ai trouvé que énormément de choses avaient été dites que je voulais dire et donc je n'ai plus grand chose à dire parce que vous avez presque tout dit. Mais je crois qu'il peut être intéressant de regarder finalement comment des historiens français tels que moi, nous ne sommes pas très nombreux, nous en sommes venus à nous intéresser aux questions postcoloniales et aux questions décoloniales. La situation en France a été décrite en partie tout à l'heure. Je crois qu'il est intéressant d'ajouter que dans le domaine de la recherche, dans le domaine académique, pour ce qui concerne l'histoire, mais on pourrait étendre ce constat à l'ensemble des sciences sociales, qu'il s'agisse de la sociologie, de l'anthropologie, peut-être moins de la littérature comparée, mais on constate que les questions postcoloniales étaient presque totalement absentes en France pendant les dernières décennies. Dans le livre que vous avez cité, le postcolonialisme, j'essaie de comprendre pourquoi le livre d'Édouard Saïd, L'orientalisme, qui est un des fondements de la perspective postcoloniale, a été accueilli si difficilement en France dans les années 1980. Alors, il y a beaucoup de raisons à ça sur lesquelles je ne peux pas m'attarder parce qu'en partie, ça a été dit, mais signalons simplement deux choses. La première chose qu'il faut comprendre, c'est qu'en histoire, les recherches académiques, elles sont séparées en fonction de ce que Fernand Braudel, qui était un grand historien français, appelait les aires culturelles. Les aires culturelles, donc, on s'intéresse par exemple à l'Afrique. Alors, vous avez les études, ce qu'on appelle les études africaines, les africanistes. Vous pouvez vous intéresser aux Amériques, vous pouvez vous intéresser à l'Inde, etc. Mais quand on s'intéresse à ces parties du monde, le projet de Brodel était vraiment de comprendre des civilisations différentes, et ça avait cet intérêt parce que ça permettait d'aborder bien des questions qui sont aussi au cœur des post-colonial studies, comme la question de l'altérité, de la différence, des fonctionnements autres que ceux de l'Occident. Mais par contre, cette division en aires culturelles ne permettait pas deux choses. La première chose que ça ne permettait pas, c'était d'envisager les interactions entre les métropoles et les colonies. C'est-à-dire comment, d'une certaine manière, les colonies colonisent la métropole. Et ça, évidemment, c'est un des axes principaux des post-colonial studies, c'est-à-dire comment la colonisation résonne, structure dans les métropoles, à savoir que, eh bien, si vous prenez n'importe quel secteur, qu'il s'agisse de l'architecture, de l'éducation, des arts graphiques ou tout ce que vous voulez, évidemment, les répercussions du colonial, elles sont absolument fondamentales. Moi, j'ai beaucoup travaillé, pour prendre mon exemple personnel, j'ai beaucoup travaillé sur les corpus iconographiques. C'est comme ça, en fait, qu'on en est venu avec d'autres collègues à s'intéresser aux questions postcoloniales, puisque on s'est aperçu qu'au XIXe siècle, l'iconographie, ce qu'on appelait l'iconographie coloniale, hein, toutes les représentations qui touchaient à la fois les populations colonisées, mais aussi les espaces coloniaux, prenaient une ampleur de plus en plus évidente et de plus en plus massive au fur et à mesure que la conquête progressait. Et ça nous donnait une configuration historique très caractérisée qu'on a appelée, nous, culture coloniale. Culture coloniale qui est composée de l'ensemble des dispositifs culturels qui s'inspirent ou sont directement issus, finalement, de la colonisation. Je vais prendre un exemple très simple pour rendre plus compréhensible graphique, et que quand vous reprenez les représentations, par exemple, des populations arabes, c'est extrêmement intéressant. Vous vous apercevez que dès les années 1830, c'est-à-dire dès le début de la conquête de l'Algérie, en fait, il y a une archéologie, finalement, des stéréotypes qui sont projetés sur les Arabes, qui va avoir une durée de vie extrêmement longue. Alors, ces stéréotypes, ils sont principalement centrés autour, je dirais, de la religion musulmane, qui est la grande altérité, je dirais, par rapport à la chrétienté européenne. Et autour de cette religion musulmane, donc, on va dresser tout un ensemble de portraits qui vont être ceux d'une religion fondamentalement patriarcale, fondamentalement obscurantiste, fondamentalement anti-moderne, qui est en fait un obstacle global au progrès de la civilisation que la colonisation est censée apporter. Et quand vous observez simplement cette archéologie mentale, finalement, des représentations sur l'arabe, vous constatez que non seulement elle perdure pendant toute la période coloniale, mais qu'évidemment, elle perdure après la période coloniale. Et pour nous, qui étions des historiens, des jeunes historiens français, c'était un peu une découverte de constater, d'une part, que la colonisation colonisait la métropole, et que d'autre part, la rupture entre période coloniale et post-coloniale, finalement, n'avait pas grand sens. N'avait pas grand sens. Je vais prendre un deuxième exemple pour expliciter un peu la trajectoire intellectuelle qui nous a amené à nous intéresser vraiment aux questions post-coloniales. On a travaillé également sur un ensemble de manifestations qu'on a appelées les zoos humains. Alors, qu'est-ce que c'était que les zoos humains? C'était en fait ce qu'on peut appeler des exhibitions ethniques. On faisait venir des colonies, mais pas seulement, des territoires extra-européens d'une manière générale, des populations qu'on présentait dans des lieux qui étaient jusqu'alors dédiés à la présentation d'animaux. Par exemple des zoos, des jardins zoologiques d'acclimatation, et puis ça a essaimé un peu partout. On en retrouve dans les grandes expositions coloniales sous diverses formes, des exhibitions ethnographiques, des villages nègres, etc. Et on s'aperçoit que d'une part, ces exhibitions, elles commencent en gros en Angleterre à partir du milieu du 19e siècle. Alors bien sûr, tout le monde connaît le précédent historique fondateur qui est l'épopée de la Vénus hottentote, mais ça va devenir un véritable système à la fois culturel. Il y a quelques interférences. Oui, qui va devenir donc un système culturel, mais aussi un système économique. Et ce dont on s'aperçoit avec ces exhibitions ethniques, c'est que, d'une part, elles ne concernent pas que les métropoles coloniales, hein, même si ce sont elles qui les initient. On s'aperçoit que la circulation des troupes, c'est une circulation transnationale qui concerne l'ensemble des pays européens, c'est-à-dire évidemment pas seulement la France, la Grande-Bretagne, la Hollande, ou l'Allemagne, par exemple, avant 1918, mais l'ensemble des contrées européennes. Ça concerne aussi les États-Unis, où on observe à peu près le même phénomène avec les Indiens d'Amérique, et puis par le fait qu'un certain nombre de troupes vont être transférées, si je puis dire, circuler jusqu'aux États-Unis. On va observer le même phénomène au Japon. Donc on a ces phénomènes concomitants qui concernent l'ensemble finalement de l'Occident plus le Japon. Et ces troupes vont avoir également une circulation transcontinentale. On voit des échanges qui se font entre les États-Unis et l'Europe, entre le Japon et les États-Unis, à l'occasion de grandes exhibitions. Soit les troupes sont autonomes et elles circulent pour des raisons financières dans l'ensemble des villes européennes et américaines ou japonaises, soit à l'occasion, par exemple, je donne un seul exemple, la grande exposition universelle de Saint-Louis en 1904. Elle va regrouper des villages et des exhibitions qui viennent des colonies françaises, comme des Sénégalais, des Ashantis, etc. Mais elle regroupe aussi des groupes minoritaires japonais, les Aïnous, qui sont considérés un peu comme les sauvages de l'intérieur du Japon, et puis des populations comme des populations tribales, entre guillemets, coréennes ou chinoises, qui sont d'ailleurs les premières régions que va conquérir le Japon pendant l'entre-deux-guerres. Donc on s'aperçoit que non seulement il y a une dimension qui excède très largement, bien sûr, les métropoles coloniales, que ça concerne tout l'Occident, que d'autre part, on a donc cette circulation transnationale. Et puis, enfin, dernier élément, on n'a pas non plus là de rupture chronologique entre colonisation et décolonisation. C'est-à-dire qu'un certain nombre de pays, ces troupes vont continuer à circuler jusque dans les années 1960. Donc, c'est très intéressant pour nous aussi parce que ça démontre que la rupture coloniale, postcoloniale, bien, elle est extrêmement relative. Et vous voyez qu'on en est arrivé à s'interroger, en fait, alors tout ceci peut paraître banal, mais pour nous, ça ne l'était pas, historiens français. On en est arrivé à s'interroger finalement sur plusieurs plans. Le premier plan, c'est comment expliquer que pour les pays colonisés, l'acceptation du fait que la rupture colonisation-post-colonisation est globalement remise en cause et acceptée comme une simplification. Il y a beaucoup de travaux dans l'historiographie française et européenne qui montrent qu'après les indépendances, en gros après 1960, pour aller très vite, hein, je ne peux pas détailler, mais après 1960, évidemment, il y a des processus coloniaux qui se poursuivent dans les États décolonisés. Il s'agisse des trajectoires de l'État, qu'il s'agisse des modes de gouvernance, qu'il s'agisse des relations avec les ex-métropoles. On a des exemples incroyablement multiples qui montrent la persistance du colonial dans la période postcoloniale. Alors, le cas de la France est même caricatural lorsqu'on prend exemple sur ce qu'on appelle son précaré africain et l'influence constante qu'elle exerce jusqu'à aujourd'hui via sa politique monétaire, ses bases militaires, sa politique linguistique et culturelle sur ces ex-pays colonisés qui subissent encore aujourd'hui l'influence postcoloniale de la France. Donc, sur cette question, il y a une entente. Sur la question de savoir si la France est dans une continuité postcoloniale, par contre, là, ça pose des difficultés extrêmement profondes. Et je crois que le meilleur exemple qu'on en a aujourd'hui, il est de deux ordres. La première réflexion que je veux faire, c'est qu'en France, et quelles que soient les sciences sociales, je connais mieux l'histoire, mais quelles que soient les sciences sociales, on a une véritable difficulté à promouvoir des études postcoloniales. Et je ne parle même pas des études décoloniales, qui est devenu quasiment un anathème en France. C'est quasiment une source d'exclusion. On a extrêmement donc de difficultés à promouvoir ces recherches au niveau académique, ce qui est surprenant du point de vue de la configuration aujourd'hui des échanges académiques mondiaux, parce que les études postcoloniales, ça fait partie, je dirais, du b.a.-ba maintenant, aujourd'hui, des courants historiographiques contemporains. Et c'est vrai que moi qui travaille en Suisse, mais qui ai beaucoup de relations évidemment avec la France, mes collègues qui travaillent en Suisse, qui sont très internationalisés, me regardent avec des yeux totalement surpris, pour ne pas dire stupéfiés, au regard de la situation française et de la situation, je dirais, de rejet quand même global des études postcoloniales et encore plus des études postcoloniales dans les sciences sociales en général et dans l'histoire en particulier. Donc ça, c'est la première chose. Il y a cette première strate, je dirais, qui est la strate académique, la résistance des académiques, que je n'ai pas le temps d'expliquer parce qu'elle tient à beaucoup de facteurs. On en a parlé, l'idée d'universalisme républicain, qui fait partie vraiment de notre corpus politique très intimement incorporé et qu'il est très difficile de séparer.
Nicolas, je suis désolée de vous interrompre, mais si vous pouvez conclure avec le deuxième point, et puis désolée,
alors
désolée,
dans
l'intérêt du temps, afin que les autres peuvent vous poser des questions aussi. Merci.
Alors, je conclus en disant que le deuxième point que je veux donner, que je veux dire, c'était un petit peu évoqué tout à l'heure, c'est qu'il y a une deuxième strate qui est celui du débat public. Un débat public qui aujourd'hui est extrêmement violent. Je crois que personne ici, dans cette assemblée, ne peut se rendre compte de la violence des échanges aujourd'hui dans le débat public. On a évoqué Frédéric Vidal. Il y a une offensive qui est notre ministre de l'Éducation nationale, enfin de l'enseignement supérieur, qui est censé nous protéger, nous, chercheurs, et qui a instauré un climat de défiance, un climat de quasi-maccartisme. Et aujourd'hui, vous n'avez pas idée du déchaînement médiatique qui s'opère autour de cette chimère, de cette folie, de croire qu'il y aurait des islamo-gauchistes qui submergeraient l'université, alors qu'on n'a pas d'études postcoloniales en France. On est dans une espèce de fiction, de folie qui rend encore plus difficile aujourd'hui, évidemment, tout dialogue et qui polarise totalement les positions. C'est face à ces difficultés que moi, je voulais témoigner ce soir.
Je vous remercie d'avoir expliqué les difficultés en fait auxquelles les universitaires font face maintenant, surtout les universitaires qui travaillent dans le champ des études postcoloniales, mais aussi de nous rappeler cette idée de l'archéologie mentale du colonialisme qui existe, ou l'architecture mentale aussi. Donc, je vous remercie. Donc, we're now going to go to Charles Forsdick as our last presenter, and then we should have time for discussion. So if people want to start putting their questions in the chat, that would be great. Over to you, Charles.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Nikki. Thank you to AUPHF Plus for providing the platform for such important discussions. We heard 3 brilliant presentations earlier, presenting some truly inspiring work, and it's a real pleasure for me to share this final platform with Rihanna and Nicola too. I think what's emerged from the panel has been this sense that the decolonisation of French studies is, to borrow your terminology, Nikki, it needs to be grounded in the work of repair. It needs to be reliant on what we heard about earlier, active decentering and the adoption of multiple perspectives. And I think also this process needs to be fundamentally engaged, not just with wider concerns, but also with the wider world. And that broader context seems really important to me, because this panel is part of an acceleration of the commitment to structural change that we've seen over the past few years, particularly over the past 12 months. It's part of a recognition of the way in which disciplinary practices, whether they're evident through teaching or through research, perpetuate inequalities of the type that Rihanna spoke about so eloquently in that brilliant project that she's launched, but also perpetuates imperial epistemologies. What really interests me, and I think we've seen evidence of it today, is this new purposefulness. And to go back to one of the first questions, I think it's that new purposefulness that distinguishes us from where we were maybe 20, 25 years ago. Yes, we're building on brilliant earlier work, Francophone postcolonial studies, the recognition of a wider Francosphere as part of a move beyond the nation state as a sole point of reference. But the risks we grappled with 20 years or so ago we've got to face them again today. What are those risks? Well, superficial diversification, solipsism. That really worries me. That sense that the work we do is not co-created, we don't listen, we don't look out for new interlocutors. There's a risk that we don't think structurally and methodologically. We don't see, as Ruth said, this is part of an ongoing process, which needs an uncompromisingly systematic approach. And the final point, and this sometimes seems quite strange when you're talking to modern linguists, there's a risk that we perpetuate monolingualism through our practices, but just in another language. And that's the big problem with that term, Francophone world. It on the one hand, it widens and diversifies, but on the other, it shuts down. One thing we haven't talked about, and I think it's quite important to signal this, is that part of decolonising French studies is thinking about where we've come from. Now, like international relations, like a number of other fields, French studies is an imperial discipline. It emerged in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was part of a process, a broader process in modern languages of foregrounding colonial languages as the most widely taught languages. And we mustn't forget where we come from historically. Because I think that decolonising French studies is rooted in this challenge to a whole set of methodological assumptions that we have inherited. And sometimes we don't question enough. They're assumptions around ethno-linguistic nationalism, which, as we know, is key to French republicanism. They're assumptions about ideological monolingualism and its universalization. Now, those practices have historically been the source of linguophobia, the creation of hierarchies of language. Look at the status of Arabic in France today. They've been also historically sources of epistemicide, that is, the extinguishing of certain forms of knowledge privileged over others. So I think what's key to our discussions today is this acknowledgement of the normative assumptions which so often are entrenched in modern languages. Ruth spoke about moving from monolingualism to multilingualism. I think that's really important. Foregrounding the politics of language to allow us to reflect on how often in our own practice we have internalized those politics of language. So I think, and a number of the colleagues today have spoken about this, we need to emphasize the pedagogical implications of what we're reflecting on. Challenge to the myth of the native speaker is important. Embracing intralingual diversity, understanding, I think Ruth said this, linguistic incompetence as a tool for the language learner. Challenging monolingualism as the unmarked case, understanding that French, and this has come through very clearly from this session, French exists, even in France itself, let's not forget, in multilingual and diglossic situations, with Arabic, with Wolof, with Creole. If we open up to other languages, that means crucially, as we've seen throughout the presentations, we need to listen to other voices that perhaps previously have been muzzled and muffled in our field. In terms of practical steps then, I've spoken about pedagogy. Well, I think for me, the key practical issue is that we need to adopt, and Marion said this at the beginning, fundamentally, uncompromisingly systematic approaches to rethinking pedagogy, methodology, to redefining the parameters of our field. Now, part of that, and Nikki spoke about this, Nikki, you spoke about this brilliantly, is an active reflection on positionality. And that's absolutely crucial. If French studies is to continue as a discipline, if we are to continue to center colonial languages in modern languages, we need to frame that activity in decolonial ways. Now, that means, as I've said already, the importance of listening. In terms of research and teaching, it means that we need to cite with an eye to decolonizing. Anglo-centric metrics and impact factors are part of imperial knowledge systems. We need to engage with those who live and work in languages other than English. We need to be open to indigenous knowledge systems. I work, as some of you know, a lot on Haiti, and engaging with thought in Creole, whether that's published or not, is very important. Ruth, I think, crucially talked about the digital. Part of decolonisation, whilst bearing in mind the digital divide, which is very big, as we all know, between global north and the majority world, we need to think about the role of the digital in creating new connections, in co-creating knowledge, and crucially, Ruth spoke about open access in sharing work. Now, that embracing of the digital links into this notion that's been throughout the panel today of seeking out new companions, seeking out new interlocutors. Nikki's work with INOSAR is exemplary in that regard. Ruth spoke to us very clearly about learning from the Africanization of the curriculum in sub-Saharan Africa. And I just wanted to note as an aside, the Global Challenge Research Fund, the UKRI Global Challenge Research Fund, which has been a great tool. It has its flaws, but it's been a great tool for encouraging the decolonisation of French studies among other subject areas. The fact it's just had this £120 million cut, which has meant that a number of projects have been defunded whilst they are in the middle of their activity, has wrought untold damage, I think, on the types of efforts we're talking about today. We need to continue to work creatively, we need to improvise, we need to move out of our comfort zone. Now, in my last just under two minutes, Nikki, limits. Now, what's been very clear in this panel has been this is not a single practice of decolonisation. Not only is it chronologically ongoing, it's also diversified in the present moment. It links to transnationalisation, it links to questions around intersectionality as well. Decolonising looks different across our subfields. Medieval studies, and yes, Ruth, we need to avoid presentism. In linguistics, in gender studies, we could carry on. Part of the challenge, clearly, for those of us who are perhaps more active in the post-colonial, decolonial fields, is to say to those in other areas of French studies, this activity is part of their responsibility too. There's a need to recognise that shared work of listening and challenging. Final point, and I think we need to dwell on this because it's really important. As an impediment, let's look at the political context in which we are working. We've talked about France. We've talked about the assault on the decolonial led by leading intellectuals like Pierre Nora, which recently has transformed into the invention of Islamo-gauchism, which we've spoken about in this panel already. Attempts to stifle debate and to defend the universalism of whiteness. UK can't be let off the hook. We've got government ministers who are attacking critical race theory. We've got the common sense group of conservative MPs silencing those who attempt to create links between our national heritage and slavery and colonialism. This is a hostile context to the type of work we're trying to do. The real risk I see is that it's all right to say that languages can be instrumentalized, and I shall stop Nikki, but can be instrumentalized in supporting the project of global Britain. When it is not all right is when languages form part of a critique of global Britain and critique of global France. We're in a context in the arts and humanities of a government pushing a project of divide and rule, and we have to be very, very cautious about that. That said, this is a two-way process. Let's be positive. Part of decolonisation of French studies is, in a true French tradition, autocritique, and that's what we've engaged in this afternoon, but it's also discerning the active catalytic contribution that we in modern languages committed to decolonisation of the curriculum and research can contribute to wider processes. And let's not forget that decolonisation, when it's carried out in English, perpetuates inequalities. So what I'm, I suppose, in conclusion, trying to promote, you all know this already, is to ensure that these debates are linguistically sensitive and we see the role of language and translation in knowledge creation. But sorry I ran over a bit, Nikki, but thanks so much to the other speakers. Really fruitful, provocative set of interventions, as I hope you saw there.
Fantastic. I can feel like the passion coming through the screen here. It's absolutely great. Thank you to all three of you for some really inspiring talks there. We have got time for a few questions, or if nobody's got some questions, I've got some questions. Okay, perhaps I'll just you know, I love this idea of I can't read my writing, that's the problem. I've just been scribbling and scrawling. But this idea that you mentioned, Charles, about a new purposefulness. And Rihanna, you talked about, you had that question, which I thought was so important on your slide, where you talked about who is the scholar activist? What does that mean? And I really think that's important to define, like the ethics, like what does that mean? What are the ethics of that? I'd really love it if you could kind of talk a little bit more to that. And then for Nicola, je suis consciente du fait qu'il y a toujours des tensions entre les activistes d'un côté et puis les historiens de l'autre côté. Donc, comment est-ce qu'on peut résoudre ces tensions entre ces deux groupes de personnes qui sont souvent opposées, surtout dans les médias? So those are the kind of questions that struck me. And to Charles, just kind of thinking about that ethics around scholar activism and how we kind of incorporate that into our institutions. So those are some of the questions. Perhaps Rihanna, if you wouldn't mind, I'll go to you first. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so in that question of who should be a scholar activist, I think I was definitely centering those sort of like radical experiences at university as well, and thinking about, you know, oppositional knowledge and about who is centered in when we think about the academic, who are we imagining as our, you know, as our prime student. And I think that that does have a tendency to run towards being, you know, your cis het white man. And so when we're thinking about who has the duty to do this work as well, even though that is our imagined student for a lot of people, the job of doing the work of decolonizing the institution disproportionately falls to marginalized academics. And I know this because, I mean, when I talk to other PhD students, they're not doing they're not putting in half of the labor and the hours of time that I do. Like, even just thinking about people who are looking to join the PhD program, or when anyone has any pastoral concerns, like I have way more office hours than I'm paid for. You know, I'm just a student. And then I think about how many of my peers, this imagined ideal student, are completely free of all of these burdens and who just have the time to sit down and write and work on their PhD and churn out papers. Like, God knows I'm behind on my actual work and not really known for my actual work. I wonder what kind of disservice that does to me later down the line when the time comes to get a job and everyone just thinks of me as EDI girl. That's a problem. So when we're thinking about who needs to take on this kind of labor, and also thinking about how this labor can be properly compensated and properly thought of as part of, because, you know, it's not that I mind doing it. Like, I am interested in building an academy that I feel like I belong in, and I'm interested in helping people to, you know, join the spaces that I'm in. But at the same time, it's a lot of unacknowledged labor that will in no way serve me. So I'm kind of fixing up an institution that there's no guarantee that there'll be a place for me when I'm done. So I think that when we're thinking about, you know, these real issues of who should be doing this work, it's understanding that the work is being done, it's just not by everyone. So I guess when I'm saying who should be a scholar activist, it's more of a call to arms for people who aren't having to think about this every day when they set foot in the building by virtue of who they are.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Like the emphasis on shared responsibility and the recognition of the amount of emotional and temporal labor that this takes from people such as yourself, like working on Project Myopia and all the things you've been doing. But yeah, that needs full recognition, absolutely. Nicola Boncel.
Oui, alors je ne sais pas si je peux vraiment répondre à votre question. Je ne sais pas comment réduire les tensions entre monde académique et activiste, parce que aujourd'hui il y a un processus qui se passe en France qui est tout à fait remarquable. Parce que, comme je disais tout à l'heure, il y a vraiment une polarisation des positions. C'est-à-dire que d'un côté, vous avez des groupes qui sont très minoritaires, mais qui vont faire des actions un peu spectaculaires et médiatiques dans le sens d'une reconnaissance, par exemple, des minorités, etc., et qui vont reprendre un vocabulaire qui est proche du vocabulaire postcolonial ou décolonial, mais qui souvent vont le radicaliser, vont le caricaturer, et ça produit, si vous voulez, l'effet inverse, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a une crispation terrible aujourd'hui dans la société civile, et face à ces actions qui sont vraiment très minoritaires, il y a une polarisation vers la droite, hein, voire l'extrême droite, d'un certain nombre d'universitaires également, hein, qui participent à cette croisade anti-post-colonial studies, anti-décolonisation studies. Et donc, il n'y a pas de rapprochement. Moi, je crois que l'activisme a une vertu, c'est celui de poser des questions. Et quand on regarde l'histoire de l'université française a toujours été un lieu de débat extrêmement difficile, extrêmement dur, sur des questions fondamentales qui ont été celui du communisme, qui ont été celui de l'impérialisme, du colonialisme. Et dans les années 70, eh bien, vous aviez des gens comme Michel Foucault, que tout le monde connaît, qui avaient des positions politiques extrêmement tranchées, extrêmement intéressantes, et qui créaient un débat à l'intérieur de l'université. Aujourd'hui, on n'est plus au stade du débat. On est au stade d'un affrontement qui rend aveugles les uns et les autres. Le deuxième élément qui me semble intéressant, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, dans l'université française, on a une génération de jeunes chercheurs qui arrivent et qui sont en partie issus des minorités postcoloniales et qui, eux, s'intéressent à ces questions à la fois d'histoire de l'immigration, les liens entre l'histoire de l'immigration et l'histoire coloniale, la question du racisme, de l'antériorité des représentations raciales à partir de la colonisation, etc. Et on voit que dans l'université française, il n'y a pas de place pour eux. Tout simplement, il n'y a pas de place. D'abord, il n'y a pas beaucoup de postes, il faut le dire, dans les sciences sociales, mais en plus, comme ces thématiques ne sont pas développées, il n'y a pas de place pour eux. Et on voit ces étudiants, qui sont des gens qui vont avoir une thèse, là aussi, rentrer dans pour certains d'entre eux, une forme de radicalisation, une forme d'amertume, de ressentiment, qui va pouvoir s'exprimer non plus dans le cadre académique, mais va s'exprimer ailleurs, dans la société civile, à travers ces associations minoritaires. Alors, comment faire le lien? Je ne sais pas. La seule possibilité, c'est que l'université retrouve une éthique de la discussion, ce qu'on n'a pas aujourd'hui. Aujourd'hui, une éthique de l'affrontement, une éthique de l'affrontement aveugle. Et c'est une période dont je ne peux pas prévoir, je dirais, la destination. Ça ne présage rien de bon, selon moi. Mais si on ne retrouve pas un minimum de possibilités dialogiques à l'intérieur de l'université, alors le radicalisme des deux côtés a de très beaux jours devant lui.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup pour cette idée, peut-être de développer une éthique de la discussion possible, je ne sais pas, on verra. Mais peut-être ça va être ces étudiants qui vont vraiment pousser l'académie à changer dans l'avenir, on va voir. Mais oui, okay. Charles, we're now like out of time, and so I don't want to keep everybody for too much longer. But Charles, if you could perhaps take
Nikki, just 1 minute on that question of activism and that question of ethics. I think what we're seeing more broadly in modern languages is this, and Claire Guerrara talks about this, is this shift from advocacy to activism. And that takes on particular decolonial forms. I think your work with NOSAR is a particularly strong example of that. It's invidious to mention others, but I think Anne-Louise Milne's work in Paris with marginalized communities is part of that as well. That activism operates on multiple levels. Some of it is outward looking. And this seeking out, in your work, in Ruth's work, and others' work, of new interlocutors, new collaborators, is really important, because it's activism which is actually improving the way we do our work. But then there's sort of more inward-looking work, and Rihanna mentioned this, and that's this scrutiny of the broken pipeline, which means that as opposed to widening participation, we're narrowing participation in our area. Two final things. I think one thing that's come out of this session really clearly, and is the need for all of us to think about how we embed these practices in our teaching. Because if we can do that successfully, then it becomes part of the formation of different understandings of citizenship which emerge from our subject field. In terms of ethics, well, an emphasis on co-creation of research, and I very much was listening to what Rihanna was saying there. It's part of the report we wrote that you mentioned, Nikki, in the introductions. This idea of the ethics of co-creation, which on the one hand focus on correct remuneration, but also very attentive to the division of labour. And I suppose the final point I'd make And this is to do with listening. And those of you who know me will realize this is slightly ironic. There clearly is an importance at times ethically to be quiet.
Thanks, Charles. Okay, we're at 4 minutes past 5. So if I can thank you all, Rihanna, Nicola and Charles, for your great interventions and your inspirational words. I'll send you my, on behalf of everyone, that was fab. And I'll pass you back to Marion. Thank you.
Yes, I really just to say thank you very, very much for our speakers for such absolutely brilliant presentations. And I think this was truly, truly inspiring and very, very enriching. Thank you, everybody. Really fantastic. And yes, lovely to see you all, and thank you for everybody also who participated in this conversation, in the discussion where we've recorded. So hopefully, very, very soon, actually the recordings are going to be up on the AUPHF Plus website. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.